He paid $63,000 for 16 cars nobody wanted. The crowd laughed. The cameras caught it. Vanessa Holloway, CEO of Dominion Automotive, called it the most embarrassing purchase she'd ever witnessed at a salvage auction. She said it loud enough for people to record. By the following Tuesday, the clip had been shared 40,000 times. All of it mockery. All of it aimed at one quiet mechanic loading broken cars onto a flatbed in the rain. What none of them saw, what none of them thought to look for, was what Ethan Mercer had already found before he ever raised his bid card. Drop a like, leave your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The Kellerman Regional Salvage Auction ran every third Saturday of the month out of a converted grain facility on the eastern edge of Harwick County, and it smelled exactly like what it was: old oil, rust scale, and the particular sourness of metal that had spent too long in weather it wasn't designed for. The building had been a grain elevator once, maybe 60 years back, and whoever converted it into an auction house hadn't spent much on the conversion. The ceiling was high and drafty. The lighting came from industrial fixtures that buzzed at a frequency you stopped noticing after about 20 minutes, and the concrete floor had been patched so many times in so many different shades of gray that it looked like a badly assembled puzzle. Ethan Mercer had been coming here for 11 years. He knew which row of folding chairs had the best sightline to the staging floor. He knew that the coffee from the machine near the east entrance tasted like the inside of a car battery, and that the coffee from the cart the Mendez family ran near the main doors was decent if you got there early enough. He knew which of the auction staff would actually answer a question and which ones would tell you to check the catalog. He knew the catalog was usually wrong about mileage and almost always wrong about interior condition. He arrived at 6:47 that Saturday morning, well before the 9 o'clock opening bid. The lot he was interested in, Lot 47C, 16 vehicles sold as a grouped package, no individual separation, had been listed online for 11 days. He'd driven past the staging yard twice before this morning just to look at them through the fence. What he'd seen through that fence was enough to make him wake up at 4 in the morning and lie there staring at the ceiling until his alarm went off. He carried a legal pad and a cup of the Mendez coffee. He found his usual seat near the end of the third row, set his jacket over the back of it, and pulled out the page of notes he'd been working on since the lot went live. The notes were not neat. They weren't meant to be. They were a working document. Measurements he'd estimated from photographs, frame details he'd tried to identify from the rust patterns, a rough tally of what restoration materials would run if his best case read on those vehicles turned out to be wrong. By 7:15, the hall was filling up. The Kellerman auction drew a regular crowd: dealers, flippers, a handful of restorers like Ethan, the occasional private buyer who'd seen a listing online and driven 2 hours hoping to find a diamond. The professional crowd was easy to spot. They moved differently, checked their phones less, carried their own notes. The civilians clutched the printed catalog like it was going to protect them. Ethan was watching the staging floor when he heard the shift in the room, that particular change in ambient noise that meant someone important had walked in and a fair number of people had noticed. He turned, though he already had a guess. Vanessa Holloway had come herself. That was unusual. Dominion Automotive had sent buyers to Kellerman before, usually a procurement specialist named Darnell Graves, a precise and humorless man who bid without expression and never spoke to anyone he didn't need to. Vanessa came to the big regional auctions, the ones that made industry news. The Kellerman Monthly was not that. She was 44 according to what Ethan had read about her, though she moved and held herself like someone who thought age was primarily a data point. She was wearing dark slacks and a tailored jacket that was more dressed down than her usual conference photographs suggested, but still clearly more expensive than anything else in the room. She had 2 people with her: a young man in a sport coat who was almost certainly an assistant, and a woman who carried a portfolio and kept slightly behind, which said legal or acquisitions, possibly both. They moved toward the front of the room, where Kellerman's senior staff had set up a small reserved area for VIP bidders. Ethan watched Vanessa scan the room the way executives did when they were assessing a space they'd decided not to be impressed by. Her eyes moved over the rows of folding chairs, the buzzing fixtures, the patched floor, the catalog stack by the entrance. Whatever conclusion she reached, she kept it to herself. Ethan looked back at his notes. What? At 9 o'clock, Ted Kellerman Jr., who had inherited the auction from his father, and had the particular kind of confidence that came from having grown up in a place and never having reason to question whether you belonged there, took the podium and walked through the standard opening: auction rules, bidder registration, payment procedures, the liability language about buying vehicles as is. Most of the room already knew it by heart. The civilians read along on their catalogs. The first 2 hours moved through individual lots without drama. A 98 F-150 with a rebuilt title and questionable documentation on the engine swap. A set of 3 Japanese imports that a dealer from the coast bought efficiently and without apparent emotion. A 2003 Suburban that had been in a flood and been badly dried out, which 2 people bid on past its actual value before the smarter one dropped out and the other realized what he'd done roughly 30 seconds after the gavel came down. Ethan sat and waited. Lot 47C came up at 11:20. Ted Kellerman Jr. described it as a grouped salvage collection of 16 vehicles, varying condition, including a mix of domestic and import frames, years ranging from 1961 to 2004, sold as a unit with no separation. He read the catalog description in the flat, practiced voice of a man who had read 10,000 catalog descriptions and had no particular feelings about any of them. Around the room, Ethan saw the reaction he'd expected. Nothing. A few dealers glanced at the staging floor where the photos of the lot were cycling on the projection screen, made the kind of quick assessment that professionals make, and looked away. The vehicles were, in most visible respects, a collection of decay, rust, panel damage, missing glass, one pickup with a collapsed roof from what appeared to be a tree strike, a station wagon with no doors, frames that had been sitting in weather so long that the surface rust had developed its own secondary rust. Starting bid on the grouped lot is set at $8,000, Ted said. A hand came up from the dealer section, a pro forma opener, the kind of bid that meant, I might be interested if no one else is. Ethan raised his paddle. He watched a few other hands go up, worked the increments methodically, and let them fall away as the number climbed past 15, past 22. At $31,000, it was him and one other bidder, a flip dealer named Marcus Boyle, who Ethan had gone head-to-head with twice before and who had a habit of overcounting his margin on distressed vehicles. At $45,000, Boyle dropped. Ethan kept going. At $59,000, there was a small change in the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but audible. The particular sound a crowd makes when a number surprises them. A few people shifted in their seats. A dealer 2 rows back said something quietly to the person next to him. $60,000, Ted said. Ethan raised his paddle. $63,000. Any advance on 63? Nothing. Sold. Lot 47C to bidder number. Ted checked his sheet. 84. The room produced the sound of people trying to decide whether to say something out loud. Most of them settled for something between a mutter and a laugh. Ethan was already writing the final number on his legal pad. He was aware, in his peripheral vision, of Vanessa Holloway leaning toward her assistant and saying something. He didn't look up. Whatever she was saying, it wasn't for him. Not yet. It was during the payment processing, Ethan standing at the window with his documentation, writing the check against a clipboard, that he heard her voice clearly for the first time. She wasn't speaking quietly. $63,000. The tone wasn't cruelty exactly. It was the tone of someone genuinely puzzled by evidence of poor decision-making, and who didn't consider it necessary to lower her voice. For what exactly? 16 paperweights? I've seen better inventory at a compactor. A murmur of laughter from the people around her. Her assistant smiled. The woman with the portfolio kept her expression neutral, which Ethan thought showed better judgment than either of the other 2. He didn't look over. He finished writing his check and pushed it through the window. I just hope he's got a big enough dumpster, Vanessa continued, still not particularly trying to be quiet about it, because that's the only thing those cars are good for. Someone nearby laughed outright. Someone else said, Guy just paid 60 grand for scrap metal. Ethan took his receipt, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket, and walked toward the staging floor to begin arranging transport. He had called a flatbed service the night before. 2 trucks, second one on standby pending the final count. He pulled out his phone and confirmed both. He did not defend himself. He did not look back at Vanessa Holloway. He had learned, a long time ago, from a man who measured things before he spoke about them, that the best answer to that kind of noise was work. His grandfather, Ray Mercer, had run a one-bay restoration shop out of a converted barn in Pittsfield County for 31 years. He had died 8 years ago in March, on a Thursday morning, while Ethan was driving in from the city, and Ethan had not made it in time, which was something he had never fully stopped thinking about. Ray had been 77 and had refused, consistently and without much discussion, to slow down, reduce hours, or accept that the work he'd done for 3 decades was in any way contingent on his continued physical ability to do it. He had left Ethan the shop, the tools, a half-finished 1969 Pontiac that Ethan had been completing in stages over the last 8 years, and a way of looking at old vehicles that was partly mechanical knowledge and partly something harder to name. Ray had taught him that a car, particularly an older one, was a record of manufacturing decisions, of the time it was built, of every hand that had worked on it since. If you knew how to read those records, you could find things that weren't visible on the surface. Ethan had taken the shop, renamed it Mercer Restoration, added 2 bays, and built a reputation that was primarily local but occasionally reached further. He was not famous, he was not wealthy. He had a solid client base, a small but capable team of 2 part-time assistants, and enough work to keep the lights on and the equipment serviced. He had been doing this for 14 years since his grandfather took him on at 17 and started teaching him things that weren't in any manual. The buy at Kellerman had taken most of his reserve. He knew that. He'd gone into it knowing that, which is why the preparation had been so thorough and why he'd needed to be right about what he thought he was looking at. He was fairly confident he was right. Fairly. The flatbeds arrived at 12:40. The auction staff helped with basic positioning. They had a forklift for the frames that couldn't be rolled, and by 2 in the afternoon, Ethan had all 16 vehicles staged on the lot, secured, and ready for the drive back to the shop. He spent 20 minutes walking the lot one more time before they left. Not inspecting. He'd need the shop for that. Proper lighting, proper tools. Just looking. Getting the sequence right in his head. 14 of the 16 vehicles were what they looked like. Distressed salvage, with varying degrees of recoverability. The 78 Buick Estate had enough solid frame rail to justify the rebuild. The pair of mid-70s Mustang fastbacks, both rough, had panels that would have taken 4 times what he'd paid to find on the open market. The 68 Nova with the collapsed front clip was going to take real work, but the floor pans were unexpectedly clean, and clean floor pans on a 50-year-old car were worth more than most people understood. 14 vehicles. Solid. Worth what he'd paid, maybe more, maybe significantly more depending on what the full inspection showed. Then there were 2. One was a 1963 Studebaker Avanti, which was already remarkable on its own merits. A car that had been produced for only 1 year before Studebaker killed the line, designed by the same team that had worked with Raymond Loewy, a genuinely collectible vehicle that had been dismissed in the lot photos because the surface condition was brutal, and most of the people looking at those photos wouldn't have recognized what they were looking at. Ethan had spent 40 minutes the night before reading production records and comparing the partial VIN visible in one of the catalog photos against known Avanti build sequences. What he thought he was looking at was a numbers-matching car. Original engine, original transmission, under about 40 years of neglect and a paint job that someone had applied in approximately 1991 with what appeared to be house paint. The Studebaker alone justified a significant portion of the purchase price. But the 16th vehicle was the one that had kept him awake. It was listed in the catalog as a 1972 domestic prototype, condition, poor, provenance, unknown, engine, missing. That was the entire description. The catalog photograph showed what looked from a distance like a mid-sized coupe that had been sitting in a field for a long time. Frame damage visible. No badging, no identifiable manufacturer marks visible in the photo. Ethan had blown up that photograph on his laptop and looked at it for a long time. The roofline was wrong for anything produced in volume in that year. The window radius was wrong. The door proportions were wrong in a specific way. Not wrong like an amateur modification, wrong like someone had made a deliberate decision that departed from the standard production template. The door gap, visible even under the rust and the grime, was machined to a tolerance that you didn't see on a standard production line in 1972. You saw that kind of tolerance on something that was being built to prove a point. He'd pulled every reference he had on domestic prototype programs from the late 60s and early 70s. He'd called a man named Gerald Schott, who was 73 and had spent 22 years as an engineer at one of the major Detroit houses before retiring and becoming, in his retirement, an encyclopedic and somewhat obsessive archivist of automotive development programs that had never made it to production. Gerald had looked at the photograph and been quiet for a long moment. "Where is that?" Gerald had said. "Kellerman auction. Grouped lot. No individual documentation." "Ethan." Gerald's voice had changed. "That roof line. The door treatment. That looks like it could be related to the Dunmore program. I thought the Dunmore cars were all accounted for." "3 of them are. The 4th one," Gerald had paused. "The 4th one has been missing since 1979. They had talked for 2 more hours. Ethan had taken 4 pages of notes. He had not slept well. The flatbeds pulled into the Mercer restoration lot at 4:30 in the afternoon. His assistants, Danny Rourke, and a newer hire named Cassidy Trent, were both there. Danny because Ethan had asked him to be, Cassidy because Danny had told her something was up and she was curious. They helped unload in the failing afternoon light, moving vehicles into the 2 main bays and the overflow area behind the building. The 16th vehicle, the one Ethan hadn't spoken about to anyone except Gerald Schott, went into Bay 1. He backed it in himself using the tow bar and positioned it under the main lights. He left it covered with the transport tarp for the night. Danny stood in the doorway watching him. Danny was 38, had been working with Ethan for 6 years, and had the kind of face that expressed skepticism without requiring the accompanying words. "So what's the actual plan here?" Danny said. It wasn't quite a question. "Systematic inspection. Start with the Buick estate in the morning, work through by frame condition. I want a full report on each vehicle by end of next week." "That's not what I'm asking." Ethan looked at him. "I know. The one in Bay 1. That one I look at myself first." Danny glanced at the tarp. "You spent $63,000 on the word of a photograph and a retired engineer, and 11 years of coming to this auction and knowing what I'm looking at." "Right." Danny turned to go, then stopped. "I watched the clip." Ethan didn't need to ask which clip. Someone in the auction had filmed on their phone. It had gone up within the hour. Danny turned back and met his eyes. "Did you see her face when you kept bidding?" Danny said. "No." "You should watch it." He pulled out his phone, navigated to it, held it out. "Just once." Ethan looked at the screen. It was shaky, phone camera footage, the kind that captured ambient noise badly. You could see Ethan's paddle going up and again at 63. And you could see Vanessa Holloway's expression at the moment the gavel came down. Not the laugh she'd performed afterward. Not the dismissal. The moment just before that. There was something on her face that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite recognition. It was the look of someone who had just noticed something they hadn't expected to notice and wasn't sure yet what to do with it. Ethan handed the phone back. "Get some sleep," he said. "Big week." He stayed in the shop until 11 that night. He didn't pull the tarp off the 16th vehicle. That wasn't about ritual or superstition. It was about discipline. He needed good light, rested eyes, and the right sequence of tools. He needed to approach it correctly, not in the tail end of a long day when his attention was already fraying at the edges. What he did was sit in the folding chair in the corner of Bay 1 and look at the shape of it under the tarp. The way you might look at a wrapped package when you were trying to hold yourself to the agreement that you weren't opening it yet. He thought about his grandfather. Ray Mercer had found things people had missed. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it was a casting mark that placed a part in a different production run than the rest of the car, which mattered to a collector but didn't change the world. Sometimes it was a serial number on a frame that turned a fair-price vehicle into something worth 3 times the asking. Ray had not been lucky. He had been prepared, and preparation, he said, was just what you called the process of making yourself capable of recognizing what was in front of you when it finally showed up. "The car doesn't hide from you," Ray had said once, on a Tuesday afternoon in the old barn shop, wiping his hands on a rag that had already given up on getting clean. "You just haven't looked in the right place yet." Ethan had written that down in a notebook he still had somewhere. He'd been 19. He sat in the folding chair for a while longer, then turned off the bay lights, locked the shop. and drove home. The clip crossed 40,000 views by Sunday morning. Ethan knew this because his phone had been making noise since Saturday night, with notifications from people who didn't usually contact him. A cousin he hadn't spoken to in 2 years, a guy he'd gone to high school with, a former client who sent a screenshot with the message, "Is this you? LOL, what were you thinking?" He put his phone face down on the kitchen table while he made coffee and thought about what the week ahead was going to look like. The comments under the clip, from what he'd seen, were mostly some variation of the same joke: $63,000 of scrap metal. There were a few people defending him, mechanics and restorers who understood that distressed vehicles weren't always what they appeared. But they were a minority, and the comment sections of viral videos were not where nuanced positions tended to survive. Vanessa Holloway had apparently said something on social media. He'd been told this by 3 separate people, but he hadn't gone to look at it. He had a general policy about that kind of thing, which was that it wasn't useful. Whatever she'd said, it wasn't going to change what he already knew, and it wasn't going to change what was sitting under a tarp in Bay 1. He brought his coffee out to the small table on the back porch and sat with it in the Sunday morning quiet. His house was a 20-minute drive from the shop, a small 2-bedroom that had belonged to his grandfather before him, on a road with a lot of trees and very little traffic. The yard needed work. It always needed work. He had a running list of things the yard needed that he contributed to regularly and addressed only occasionally. He thought about the Dunmore program. In 1969, a mid-tier engineering team at one of the major Detroit manufacturers had begun development work on a vehicle platform that was intended to serve as a bridge between the muscle car era, which the engineers could already see was running out of road, and whatever came next. The program was internally designated Dunmore, after the project lead's hometown, which was a common enough naming practice. The goal was a lightweight, high-efficiency chassis that could accommodate a range of powertrains while achieving performance numbers that would compete with European sport designs. It was ambitious for 1969 and almost certainly ahead of what the manufacturing infrastructure could support. The program had produced 4 prototype vehicles before being canceled in 1971. When the corporate priorities shifted toward the response to the OPEC pressure that everyone could feel coming and nobody yet wanted to officially acknowledge. 3 of those prototypes had been documented. One was in a private collection in Michigan, one had been acquired by a restoration museum in Ohio, and one had been partially dismantled and used as a development reference for later programs. Its fate a matter of reasonable disagreement among the engineers who'd been involved. The 4th prototype had been signed out of the engineering facility in September of 1971 by a project engineer named Thomas Garland, ostensibly for external testing. Garland had left the company 14 months later under circumstances that Gerald Schott described as messy, without being more specific. The 4th prototype had never been returned. If the vehicle in Bay 1 was what Ethan thought it might be, then it had been sitting in accumulated obscurity for somewhere between 45 and 50 years, passing through hands that didn't know what it was, probably documented only as a generic early 70s frame, bought and sold as scrap or project material or salvage. The kind of vehicle that moved through estate sales and storage auctions without anyone looking closely enough. That was not unusual. That was, in fact, the rule rather than the exception. The significant finds, the ones that became museum pieces and legal benchmarks, and the subjects of articles in automotive history journals, almost always had that period in the middle when they were invisible, when they were just a car nobody had looked at. Ethan drank his coffee and listened to the trees. Botem, Monday morning. He arrived at 6:30. Danny and Cassidy weren't in until 8, which was what he wanted. He unlocked Bay 1, hit the main lights, and stood for a moment while the fluorescents settled into their working frequency. The tarp was still on the vehicle. He'd locked the shop himself and the locks hadn't been touched. He pulled the tarp off in one motion. The car beneath it was not beautiful. There was nothing redemptive about its current appearance, nothing that invited the kind of emotional response that people assign to old cars when they wanted to talk about the romance of the thing. It was a coupe frame, approximately mid-70s in general proportions, covered in rust that had gone through several stages of development and was now into the kind of deep oxidization that produced a particular surface texture. Not smooth, not flaking, but almost granular, like the metal itself had changed its basic character over the decades. The glass was mostly gone. The driver's door had been pushed in at some point, probably in whatever accident or incident had sent the car into its long obscurity. The rear quarter panel on the passenger side had been partially stripped by someone at some point. The bare metal now as corroded as the rest. Ethan put on his work light and started at the front. He was not rushing. He had a procedure. He had been doing this for 14 years with his grandfather's voice in his head telling him the same things. Slow down. Look at what's there, not what you want to be there. He checked the firewall first. On a production vehicle from this period, the firewall would carry certain standard stampings, manufacturer codes, date codes, sometimes production run indicators. What he found on this firewall was different. The stampings were there, but they were lighter than production stampings, applied with less pressure and in a slightly different location than the standard template. That was consistent with a prototype. Lighter stampings because the tooling was not the production tooling, positioned differently because the prototype line didn't always follow the exact conventions of the production floor. He worked his way along the driver's side. At the B pillar, the vertical structural element between the front and rear door openings, he stopped. He'd seen this detail in the photograph. He'd spent 20 minutes with Gerald Schott talking about it, but the photograph had been a compressed JPEG from a catalog, and now he was standing 6 inches away with a work light, and what he was looking at was not ambiguous. The B pillar carried a small plate, roughly 2 inches by 1 inch, attached with 3 bolts that were not the standard bolts used in production vehicles of this era. The plate itself had been painted over at some point, painted over and then rusted over, but under the work light, where the rust had receded slightly in a dry corner of the plate's surface, there was text. He pulled his phone out, took a photo, then took 6 more from different angles. He could make out most of it. DMOD 4, it said. And below that, a number sequence he needed Gerald's files to cross-reference. DMOD 4, Dunmore Modification, 4th Unit. He sat down on the rolling stool and looked at the plate for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called Gerald Schott. It rang 4 times. Gerald picked up on the 5th ring, which was normal. He kept his phone in the kitchen and had to walk from whatever part of the house he was in. Gerald, Ethan said, I need you to look at some photos. Hold on. Let me get to the computer. Rustling sounds, a door. Did you open it up yet? I've been at the B pillar. A pause. And? I need you to look at the photos, Ethan said again. Gerald was quiet, then, send them. Ethan sent the photos. He waited. He could hear Gerald breathing at the other end of the line, and then he heard Gerald say something that wasn't for Ethan, a quiet word, maybe to himself. And then silence. Ethan, Gerald said, that's Dunmore 4. Ethan had known that. He had been fairly certain of it since Friday night. But hearing it said out loud by a man who had spent years archiving this material and knew what he was looking at was a different thing than knowing it yourself in a room alone. Yeah, Ethan said. You understand what this means. I have a general idea. There's a lawsuit, Gerald said. Probably you already know this. Dominion Automotive and the Carver Group. Patent dispute goes back to platform architecture from the early 70s. The core of the argument is about whether Dominion's current chassis design traces to independent development or to appropriated engineering from a third-party program. A pause. The Dunmore program is the third-party program. I know. If that's Dunmore 4 and that prototype is intact enough to show the engineering specifications, I know, Gerald. Another pause. How much did you pay for it? Ethan looked at the plate on the B pillar. The tiny, careful text that had survived 45 years of field weather and bad paint and the general indifference of time. Enough, he said. He heard, very faintly, Danny's truck pulling into the lot outside. He stayed where he was for another minute, in the quiet of Bay 1, with the overhead fluorescents buzzing and the smell of old rust and the car in front of him that nobody had thought was worth $63,000. He thought about Vanessa Holloway's voice carrying across the Kellerman auction floor. He thought about his grandfather telling him that the car doesn't hide from you. Then he stood up, tucked his phone into his pocket, and went to unlock the side door for Danny. There was a lot of work to do. Danny Rourke was not a man who asked a lot of questions before he'd had his second coffee. He came through the side door at 8 o'clock with a travel mug in one hand and his jacket still half on, the way he always arrived in the colder months, and he stopped when he saw Ethan standing in Bay 1 with the tarp on the floor and the 16th vehicle uncovered under the lights. He looked at the car, then at Ethan, then back at the car. "That's not a 1972 domestic prototype," he said. The catalog said 1972 domestic prototype. The catalog also said the Buick estate had a rebuilt title when it's got 3 separate registration gaps. The catalog is not a reliable document. Danny stepped closer. He had good eyes, not trained the way Ethan's were, but he'd worked in restoration long enough to read a frame the way other people read body language. He walked the driver's side slowly, coffee forgotten in his hand. "The roofline's wrong." "Yeah, wrong for what year? Wrong for any production year. That's the point." Danny crouched at the B-pillar and looked at the plate. He couldn't read the text from that angle without a work light, but he could see the plate itself, see that it wasn't a production fitting. He straightened up and looked at Ethan with an expression that was working through several things at once. "You knew," Danny said, "before the auction." "I had a strong read. A $63,000 strong read." "Something like that." Danny set his travel mug on the tool bench. He pulled a work light from the hook on the wall and aimed it at the B-pillar plate. He read it. He read it again. Then he turned to Ethan and said, in a voice that was noticeably quieter than his usual register, "What's Dunmore for?" Ethan told him. Not everything. Not the full depth of what Gerald Schott had walked him through. Not the legal dimensions. Not the part about the lawsuit that had been working through the courts for 2 years. Just the engineering history. The program that didn't make it to production. The 4 prototypes. The 3 that were documented, and the one that had disappeared with Thomas Garland in 1971. Danny listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When Ethan finished, Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So what's it worth?" "Depends on condition. Depends on how intact the engineering is once we get into it. Depends on a few other things I'd rather not go into right now." Ballpark. Ethan looked at the car. More than $63,000. How much more? "Danny, I'm just asking." "A lot more," Ethan said. "If the frame specs are what Gerald thinks they are, if the manufacturing records can be matched, if the documentation holds." He paused. "A lot more." Danny picked up his travel mug. He took a long drink of coffee. He looked at the car with the expression of a man who was recalibrating his understanding of the situation he'd walked into that morning. "When does Cassidy get in?" he said. 8:30. "Should we tell her?" "Not yet," Ethan said. "Right now we tell nobody. Now we work the other 15 vehicles. We do this one carefully and correctly, and we don't say anything to anyone until I know what we actually have." The clip's got 60,000 views. "I know. People are going to be asking questions." "People can ask," Ethan said. "That's different from us answering." The first full week was methodical in a way that satisfied something in Ethan's nature that most people who knew him casually wouldn't have guessed was there. He was not from the outside an organized-looking person. His truck was a mess. His house was a controlled form of clutter that he understood but couldn't entirely explain to anyone else. But in the shop, his process was rigorous and sequential, because that was what the work required, and because his grandfather had instilled in him early that skipping steps in an inspection was how you missed things, and missing things was how you made decisions you couldn't undo. He worked the Buick estate first because the frame assessment was straightforward and because Danny was confident with it, which meant Ethan could supervise without being needed at every step. The Buick was better than the catalog suggested. The frame rail integrity was solid on both sides, which meant the restoration scope was manageable, and the interior, while destroyed in the obvious ways, the headliner collapsed, the seat foam compressed to board, had a dashboard that was largely intact, including the original instrumentation cluster. That mattered to buyers. Original instrumentation on a '78 Buick estate wasn't rare, but it wasn't nothing either. The 2 Mustang fastbacks came next. Cassidy handled most of the initial inspection on those because she'd done 3 Mustang restorations in the 2 years before she'd come to work at Mercer, and she moved through the assessment quickly and with confidence. Her read on the first one was good. Front subframe needed replacement, but the unibody was intact, which was the critical thing. The second one was more complicated. Someone had done body work on it at some point, amateur work, and had used filler in places where filler had no business being, which meant that what looked like solid panel from the outside was in places a quarter-inch of Bondo over rust that had kept developing beneath it. That was going to be a longer project than the first car, and more expensive. She brought Ethan over to show him, which he appreciated. Some people in her position would have written up the assessment and presented it formally. Cassidy just called him over and showed him, standing at the car with a flashlight. Here, and there's more behind the quarter panel. I haven't pulled it yet. Good catch, Ethan said. It's not that hard to find if you look. You'd be surprised. She shrugged, which was her standard response to anything that might have been read as a compliment. She was 26 and had grown up in a family that ran a body shop in eastern Tennessee before the highway expansion had taken the building, and she'd learned to read automotive damage the same way Ethan had. Not from textbooks, but from being in the shop when things were being done and paying attention. She was better than Danny on paint and bodywork. She was not better than Danny on frame and mechanical, and she knew it, and they had worked out a natural division without anyone having to manage it. Ethan went back to Bay 1. He was taking the Dunmore 4 slowly. Not because he was afraid of what he'd find. He'd moved past fear of that somewhere around the third day, when the initial measurements started coming back consistent with what Gerald Schott's archive material described. But because slowly was the right way to do it. Every measurement, every stamping, every manufacturing detail needed to be documented before he touched it. The car was a legal object now, whether or not anyone else knew that yet, and he was treating it accordingly. He'd called a lawyer on Wednesday. Not an automotive lawyer, Dem. He didn't know any automotive lawyers, but a general practice attorney named Sylvia Park, who had handled a contract dispute for him 3 years earlier and who had the particular quality that Ethan valued in legal counsel, which was that she told you things you didn't want to hear without seeming to enjoy doing it. He'd explained the situation to Sylvia over the phone. She'd been quiet in the way lawyers were quiet when they were organizing information, and then she'd said, "You own the car outright?" Bill of sale from the auction, paid in full. No liens, no title complications? The title chain has gaps. I need someone to run it properly. I can do that, or I can refer you to someone who specializes. A pause. You said there's a lawsuit between Dominion and the Carver Group. That's what I've been told. I know that case, Sylvia said. Not well, but I know it. It's been in the trade press. Another pause. Ethan, if that vehicle is what you think it is, you need to understand that there are going to be parties who will want it very badly and who will not be patient about it. I figured. You should also understand that your ownership position is strong but not unassailable. Title gaps can be challenged. Provenance can be disputed. The moment this becomes public knowledge, you will have people coming at this from directions you haven't anticipated. So what do you recommend? Document everything. Don't talk to anyone without talking to me first. And don't sell anything to anyone for any price until the title chain is established. A beat. Especially don't sell it to Dominion Automotive. Ethan had not told Sylvia about the Kellerman clip. He figured she'd find it on her own eventually. Well, Gerald Schott drove up from Claremont on Thursday. He was a small man in his early 70s who dressed like he was going to a university function and drove a 12-year-old Volvo that he'd had maintained by the same independent shop for the past decade. He arrived at 9 in the morning with a leather satchel full of documents that he'd been collecting for years. Engineering notes, internal memos, photographs of the Dunmore prototypes during the original development period, a set of technical drawings that he explained had come from a retired engineer who'd worked on the program and had kept them because nobody had told him not to. He walked into Bay 1 and stopped. He looked at the car for a long time without speaking. Ethan let him look. The door gap, Gerald said finally. Right there, you see it? That's not production tolerance. That's prototype tolerance. They were building this to show what precision manufacturing could look like, not what it actually looked like on the line. I measured it yesterday. It's within a 1/16 of an inch across the full door frame. The production vehicles of this period were running 1/4 to 3/8 variants. The Dunmore team was trying to prove it could be done tighter. Gerald crouched at the rocker panel, pulled out a small flashlight, examined the underside. The seam welding here, you see the pattern? Ethan crouched next to him. The weld seam along the rocker panel was done in a pattern that Ethan had noticed 2 days earlier and photographed, but hadn't yet fully interpreted. It was a double pass technique, 2 overlapping weld runs instead of the single pass used on production vehicles, applied in a sequence that suggested the team had been testing long-term structural integrity. They were worried about flex fatigue, Gerald said. In the design, the rocker panel takes a different load distribution than a standard production frame of this period. They knew that going in. The double pass was their solution. He stood up, his knees making the sound that knees made on a man in his 70s who had spent decades crouching at things. This is done more for, Ethan. Ethan, I've looked at the other 3. I spent 2 days with the one in Michigan and a full week with the Ohio Museum unit. This is the same program. Same hands built this. Can you put that in writing? Gerald looked at him. Is that where this is going? I think that's where this is going whether I want it to or not. Gerald nodded slowly. Let me spend the day with it. I want to cross-reference the frame stamps against what I have in the satchel. If the stamp sequence matches the production records from the other units, he stopped. It'll match, Ethan. I'm telling you right now, but I want to do it correctly. That's all I'm asking. Gerald opened his satchel on the tool bench and began laying out documents with the careful, practiced motion of someone who had been handling irreplaceable paper for a long time. The calls started on Friday. The first one was from a collector named Hartwell Briggs, who identified himself as a private automotive historian and who had, apparently, seen the Kellerman clip and done some thinking about the grouped lot. He was pleasant and indirect, asking general questions about the vehicles Ethan had acquired, not naming anything specific. Ethan was equally pleasant and equally indirect, and the call ended without either of them having said anything of substance. The second call was from a man who said he represented a private acquisition group and who offered, without preamble, to purchase the entire lot for $200,000, sight unseen. Ethan said he wasn't ready to discuss sales at this time and hung up. The third call came from a number he didn't recognize, and when he answered it, the voice on the other end was female, professional, and slightly too smooth in the way of someone who had prepared what they were going to say. Mr. Mercer. My name is Andrea Foss. I'm the head of acquisitions at Dominion Automotive. I'm calling on behalf of Dominion regarding the vehicle lot you acquired last Saturday at the Kellerman auction. Ethan sat in his office chair. The office was a small room off the main shop floor that he used primarily for paperwork and phone calls he needed quiet for. Through the window in the office door, he could see Danny working on the Buick in Bay 2. "What can I do for you, Ms. Foss?" he said. "We're interested in certain vehicles from your acquisition. Specifically, we have reason to believe that one of the units in that lot may be of historical significance to Dominion's development archive. We'd like to arrange a preliminary assessment and discuss terms." "What makes you think there's something significant in that lot?" A brief pause. "We have our own research capabilities, Mr. Mercer." "I'm sure you do." Ethan kept his voice even. "I'm not in a position to discuss sales at this time. The vehicles are undergoing assessment, and until that process is complete, we're not entertaining purchase inquiries." "We understand that. We'd like to be in conversation before you complete that process. The value we could offer—" "I appreciate the call, Ms. Foss. When I'm ready to discuss sales, I'll reach out." He hung up. He sat for a moment, looking at the phone in his hand. Then he called Sylvia Park. "They called," he said when she picked up. "Dominion?" "Acquisitions Department. They were careful about it. Didn't name the vehicle." "They won't. Not on a first call." He could hear Sylvia typing. "Did they make a number?" "She was getting there when I ended it." "Good. Don't let them make a number to you directly. Once they put a number on the table, it creates a negotiation dynamic that's hard to step back from." More typing. "The title research is moving. I should have preliminary results by Tuesday." And preliminary is looking clean. The car moved through 3 estate sales and a storage liquidation between 1979 and the early 2000s, all documented, just not connected to any automotive history because nobody knew to connect them. A pause. "Ethan, if this holds, your ownership is solid. When will we know solid? Give me until the end of next week, and in the meantime, don't talk to Dominion without me on the line." After he hung up, Ethan sat in the office for another minute. He could hear the sounds of the shop through the door, Danny's radio, the clank of tools, the particular resonance of the Buick's hood being raised and lowered, ordinary sounds. The shop doing what it did. He thought about Andrea Foss's voice on the phone, the professional smoothness of it, the careful language. We have reason to believe. Historical significance to Dominion's development archive. They were not calling because they wanted to preserve history. He understood that. They were calling because a lawsuit involving hundreds of millions of dollars in patent claims had a hole in it that could be filled or destroyed by what was sitting in Bay 1, and they had realized that the mechanic who'd bought the grouped salvage lot at Kellerman for $63,000 might have stumbled into the middle of it. The question was how much they knew, and the question under that question was what they'd be willing to do about it. Gerald Schott's written assessment arrived by email on Sunday evening, 14 pages of single-spaced technical documentation with photographs cross-referenced against the archive material in his satchel. He had matched 11 distinct manufacturing signatures between Dunmore 4 and the documented prototypes. Stamping sequences, weld patterns, material specifications visible in the surviving bodywork, fastener specifications at 3 separate structural points. He had also identified, in the surviving section of the interior firewall, a partial engineering notation in what appeared to be pencil, protected from the elements by the accumulated grime that had sealed it, that referenced a test sequence from the Dunmore program's final active phase. At the bottom of the report, Gerald had added a note that wasn't in the clinical language of the rest of the document. I have been looking for this vehicle for 11 years. I am glad it was found by someone who will treat it correctly. Ethan read the report twice at the kitchen table. Then he forwarded it to Sylvia. The week that followed was not comfortable. The calls continued. A different person from Dominion, a man this time, more senior in tone, who mentioned specific dollar figures early in the conversation without being asked, which told Ethan something about how worried they were. A lawyer representing something called the Carver Group, who was careful and polite and asked whether Ethan had retained counsel, and who, when Ethan confirmed that he had, said that his client would appreciate an opportunity to be in conversation and would Ethan please have his attorney make contact. He passed that one to Sylvia. There were also the collectors. Word had gotten into the right circles. Ethan didn't know exactly how, whether through the Kellerman lot listing or through someone who'd talked to Gerald, or through the lawsuit circles where people with money were paying close attention to what evidence might surface. A collector from the Pacific Northwest left 2 voicemails. A man who identified himself as a representative of a European automotive museum left one. Ethan didn't return any of them. Danny asked on Wednesday of that second week whether Ethan was sleeping. Some, Ethan said. You look like you're sleeping some. Danny handed him a coffee from the Mendy's cart. He'd gone to the Kellerman Overflow Market on his lunch break. What's the number now? The calls? Since Friday? 11. Not counting the ones I've let go to voicemail. And Dominion? 3 separate contacts, different people each time. Danny was quiet for a moment. They were standing in the lot outside the shop, the February cold doing what February cold did. What do they want exactly? They want the car. Obviously, but why specifically? Ethan told him about the lawsuit, the patent dispute. The Carver Group's claim that Dominion's current platform architecture traced back to engineering work that Dominion had effectively taken without authorization during a period of corporate reorganization in the late 70s. He explained what the Dunmore prototypes were in that context. Physical evidence of the original engineering specifications, documentation that the platform existed, and what it looked like before Dominion's version appeared. Danny listened. When Ethan finished, he said, So the car proves that Dominion stole something. The car is evidence of what the original engineering looked like. What it proves depends on what a court decides to do with it. But Dominion thinks it proves they stole something. Dominion is worried about it. That's what the calls tell me. Danny drank his coffee. So if you sell it to them, it disappears, or they control what happens to it, which amounts to the same thing from the Carver Group's perspective. And if you don't sell it to them, then it stays in my shop until I decide what to do with it. Ethan looked at the shop building. The sign above the door, Mercer Restoration, was the one he'd put up when he'd renamed the place 6 months after his grandfather died. He'd painted it himself, which was why one of the letters was slightly higher than the others. He'd never fixed it. which is where we are. You could sell it to the Carver Group. I could. They want it too. They want it for different reasons, and they called through a lawyer, which means they're handling it differently. Ethan finished his coffee. I'm not selling it to either of them. Not yet. Maybe not at all. Danny looked at him. You have a plan. I have the beginning of a plan. Does the beginning of a plan involve us getting paid at the end of the month? Yes, Danny. Okay. Danny crumpled his cup. I'm going to go finish the Buick. On Thursday of that second week, the clip crossed 80,000 views. More significantly, a reporter from an automotive trade publication called and left a voicemail identifying himself and asking whether Ethan would comment on rumors that the Kellerman salvage lot contained a vehicle of interest to the ongoing Dominion versus Carver litigation. Ethan did not return that call either. He called Sylvia instead. The press is going to get there, Sylvia said. It's not a question of if. I know. When they do, you don't confirm or deny anything about the litigation. You're a mechanic who bought a salvage lot and is conducting assessments. That's all. That's true. It's all true. That's why it works. He heard her chair shift. The title came back clean, Ethan. Fully documented chain from the estate sales. You own it, unambiguously, subject to no liens and no competing claims. He'd known this was coming. He'd been fairly certain it was coming. But the actuality of it was different from the expectation. Okay, he said, that changes things. It means your position is fully established before any of these parties has been able to contest it. If they were going to try to challenge ownership, they've lost the window to do it easily. A pause. There's going to be pressure, Ethan. Real pressure. These aren't small companies. I know what Dominion is. And the Carver Group is backed by people with resources that are... She stopped. Just understand that you're holding something that matters to powerful people who are not accustomed to waiting. What do you think I should do? Sylvia was quiet for a moment. I think you should be very careful about what you want out of this, because there's a version where you take a very large check and walk away with the shop funded for years. And there's a version where you try to be a principled actor in a complicated legal situation, and it costs you significantly in time and resources and stress. A beat. I'm not telling you which version to choose. I'm telling you to be honest with yourself about which one you're choosing before you commit to it. Ethan looked through the office window at Bay 1. The car was visible through the gap in the bay door, the work lights still on it from the morning's session. I appreciate that, he said. Don't thank me yet. I charge by the hour. After he hung up, he sat for a while. The thing he hadn't told Sylvia, hadn't told Danny, hadn't told Gerald in so many words, was that the decision wasn't primarily about money and hadn't been since the morning he'd pulled the tarp off the car and read the plate on the B-pillar. Money was part of it. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He had a shop to run and a team to pay and a reserve account that the Kellerman purchase had reduced to a number that required more careful management than he preferred. But the decision was about something older than that. Something that had more to do with a man in a converted barn in Pittsfield County who had taught him that what you do with what you find matters as much as whether you find it. His grandfather had found things over the years, not like this, nothing like this, but vehicles with complicated histories, cars with provenance that was unclear until it was clear. He'd handled them carefully, documented them properly, been honest about what he knew and what he didn't know. He hadn't always been rewarded for that. Sometimes being careful and honest just meant being careful and honest, and the result was the same as if you hadn't been. But Ray Mercer had done it that way anyway. Ethan got up from the chair. He had work to do. The Nova's floor pans needed a second assessment, and the Studebaker Avanti wasn't going to document itself, and Danny needed a second set of hands on the Mustang subframe before end of week. He went back into the shop. The Avanti confirmed what he'd hoped. He spent 2 full days on it, cross-referencing the partial VIN against the production records he'd been able to access through a collector registry and through a Studebaker specialist named Paul Hewitt in Indiana, who'd been cataloging these cars for 30 years, and who confirmed, with the combination of enthusiasm and pedantic precision that distinguished the best specialists in any field, that the engine block numbers matched a specific 1963 production run, and that the transmission code, partially visible under the grime on the housing, was consistent with the original build spec. Numbers matching 1963 Studebaker Avanti with documented provenance. Paul Hewitt's estimate of its potential value in restored condition was in the range of $80,000 to $120,000 depending on the quality of restoration and the state of the market when it came to sale. You understand, Paul said on the phone, that if this goes to a major auction in restored condition, you're going to have serious interest from serious collectors. I'm starting to understand that, Ethan said. Where'd you find it? Grouped salvage lot? A long pause. Someone let a numbers matching 63 Avanti go through a salvage auction. It was buried under a lot of surface rust and a paint job from the early 90s. People, Paul Hewitt said, with the particular weariness of a specialist who has spent decades watching unrecognized things be treated as worthless, are genuinely unbelievable. Ethan smiled. It was the first time he'd smiled in about 4 days. He wrote the Avanti figures into his notebook under the running tally he'd been keeping since the beginning of the second week. The tally had grown in a way that surprised even him, though he'd known from the start that the 14 production vehicles represented real value. The Buick, the 2 Mustangs with adjusted figures for the additional scope on the second one, the Nova with its clean pans, a mid-60s Corvair that had revealed under careful inspection a surprisingly intact mechanical package that collectors in that specific niche would pay significantly to acquire. Without the Dunmore 4, without the Avanti even, the 14 vehicles in the rest of the lot represented a return that justified the purchase price several times over. With the Avanti, he was looking at a margin that changed the financial picture of Mercer Restoration for several years. With the Dunmore 4, he was looking at something that didn't fit neatly into a column on a financial ledger. He added up the numbers anyway, wrote the total, and looked at it. Then he flipped to a new page and started making a different kind of list. Not financial. Something closer to what Sylvia had asked him to think about. What he actually wanted the outcome of this to look like. Not the Dominion version, where the car disappeared into a corporation's legal strategy. Not the Carver Group version, where it became a weapon in a lawsuit, and its engineering history was subordinated to the argument. Not the European Museum version, where it would be well preserved and correctly identified and also 8,000 miles away from the community of mechanics and restorers who deserved to know it existed. He wrote for about 20 minutes. Most of it was in the shorthand he used for his own notes, compressed and partly symbolic. The kind of writing that would be illegible to anyone else. At the bottom of the page, he wrote one sentence that was more legible than the rest. The car's history belongs to more people than the ones who can afford to fight over it. He looked at that for a while. Then Cassidy knocked on the office door frame and said the parts order for the Nova had come in, and did he want her to start the floor pan work? And he said yes, show Danny what you're doing before you start. And she said she would. And the shop went back to its ordinary sounds. Outside, the February afternoon was going flat and gray. The flag on the hardware store across the road was moving in a wind that had come up since morning. Ethan's coffee was cold. He left it cold and went back to work. The offer came on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the auction, and it came differently than the previous ones. The earlier calls had been from acquisition staff and intermediaries, people whose job was to open a door without revealing how badly the company needed to walk through it. This one came from a block number at 7:48 in the morning, before Danny or Cassidy had arrived, while Ethan was unlocking the shop in the cold and trying to remember if he'd left his second pair of work gloves inside or in the truck. The voice was male, unhurried, and carried the particular quality of a man accustomed to conversations where the other person understood that the call itself was significant. Mr. Mercer, my name is Richard Calloway. I'm the General Counsel for Dominion Automotive. I'd like to speak with you directly if you have a few minutes. Ethan stood in the open doorway of the shop. The morning was cold and still, the kind of cold that pressed in quietly rather than announced itself. He had his attorney's voice in his head. Don't let them make a number to you directly. But he also understood that letting Dominion's general counsel go to voicemail had a different set of implications than letting the acquisitions department go to voicemail. I have a few minutes, he said, but I'll tell you now that I'm going to have my attorney on any call that goes past introductions. That's perfectly reasonable. I'm not calling to make a formal offer. A pause. I'm calling because I think you deserve a frank conversation from someone who can actually tell you what's at stake. I have a pretty good idea what's at stake. I'm not sure you do, Calloway said. Not unkindly, more like a man stating a position he'd thought through. May I? Ethan stepped inside, shut the door behind him against the cold, and said, "Go ahead." Dominion has been involved in litigation with the Carver Group for 2 years. I'm not going to tell you the details you don't already know, because I expect you've done your research. What I want you to understand is that the vehicle you've acquired has the potential to become a central piece of evidence in a case that affects thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in platform licensing. This is not a negotiation between two corporations about money. If Carver wins this case, Dominion restructures significantly. What that means practically is that facilities close. People lose positions they've held for 20 years. Ethan was quiet. "I'm telling you this not to create pressure," Calloway continued, "but because I believe you're a person who cares about the actual consequences of decisions. The vehicle in your possession is not simply a collectible. It's a loaded instrument in a situation that is larger than the two of us. And you'd like to acquire it. We'd like to discuss a path that's fair to you and that resolves the situation responsibly." Ethan thought for a moment. He thought about Sylvia's voice telling him that there was a version where he took a large check and walked away with the shop funded for years. He thought about what Richard Calloway's version of responsibly meant versus what his own version meant. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I appreciate the candor. I'm going to ask you to put whatever you want to propose in writing and send it to my attorney. Her name is Sylvia Park. I'll have her contact information sent to whatever address you want to give me." A brief pause. "Of course. And I want to be straightforward with you in return. I'm not refusing to listen, but I need you to understand that I'm not in a hurry, and the size of the numbers involved don't change my timeline." "Understood." Another pause. "One more thing, Mr. Mercer, and I say this as a statement of fact rather than a threat. There are other parties who will be approaching you about this vehicle. Some of them will not be as straightforward about their interests as I'm trying to be." "I know," Ethan said. "They already have been." He ended the call. He stood in the cold shop and let the quiet settle around him for a moment. Then he turned on the bay lights and got to work. Sylvia called him back at noon after she'd reviewed the written terms Dominion's legal team had sent over. "They're offering $450,000, she said. "For the Dunmore prototype specifically. The rest of the lot is yours to do with as you choose." Ethan was eating a sandwich at his desk. He put it down. "That's significant, yes." Sylvia's voice was even. "It's also structured in a way that I want you to look at carefully before you react to the number. The sale includes a confidentiality agreement that covers not just the transaction terms, but the vehicle's existence, its provenance, and any documentation related to it. Signing that agreement means Gerald Schott's report goes into a drawer. The engineering history goes with the car, and where the car goes after that, you don't get to know." Ethan picked up his sandwich and then put it down again. "The Dunmore 4 disappears," he said. "That's one way to read it. Their way to read it is that a private matter is handled privately. What's your read on it?" "My read is that $450,000 is real money, and a confidentiality agreement is a legal document, and that you need to be clear on what you're actually selling before you decide whether the number is enough for it." A pause. "What's your read on it?" He looked out the office window. Bay 1. The car under the work lights. Gerald Schott had been back twice since the first visit, each time with more documentation, each time leaving a little more certain and a little more deliberate in his movements around the vehicle, the way people moved around things they understood to be significant. "No," Ethan said. "No to the offer or no to the confidentiality provision?" "No to the offer as structured. If they want to talk about a purchase that doesn't bury the history, that's a different conversation." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "That's going to make them considerably less interested." "I know. The confidentiality provision is almost certainly the point of the whole offer. Without it, a sale to Dominion doesn't help them in the litigation. It might actually hurt them." "I know that too." A longer pause. "Ethan, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think about it before you answer. What is it that you actually want to happen to this vehicle?" He'd been working on the answer to that question for 2 weeks. The page in his notebook with the sentence at the bottom was still there, and he'd added to it since. Not a plan exactly, more like a sequence of values in order. What mattered most and what mattered less, and what didn't matter at all. "I want the engineering history documented and accessible," he said. I want the people who built that car to have their work recognized correctly. I want it to be part of the record, not a footnote that gets sealed in someone's legal file." He stopped. "And I want to be able to run my shop without worrying about the reserve account." "Those are not incompatible goals," Sylvia said. "They're just not compatible with Dominion's offer as currently structured." "Tell them no. But tell them I'm open to a conversation about a different structure." "That's going to take time." "I know. And in the meantime, Ethan said, "I've got a Studebaker Avanti to restore." The Carver Group's approach was different from Dominion's in ways that told Ethan something about each organization's read on the situation. Where Dominion had escalated, starting with acquisition staff, moving to general counsel, increasing the dollar amount with each contact, the Carver Group had remained at the attorney level from the beginning, never pushing for direct contact with Ethan, always routing through Sylvia, and never putting a number on the table unprompted. They'd sent a summary of the litigation background through their counsel, a document that was clearly designed to position them as the aggrieved party seeking historical justice, rather than a corporation defending a financial interest. It was well written and not entirely inaccurate, but it was also, Ethan thought, the version of the story that made the Carver Group look best, which was the version their lawyers would naturally produce. He read it. He appreciated the effort. He didn't trust it as a complete account. What he had was a car, a documented provenance, Gerald Schott's 14-page technical assessment, and a lawyer. What both Dominion and the Carver Group had was a vested interest in controlling what happened next. He understood his position clearly, which was that he was an independent party with clean title to a piece of evidence in someone else's fight, and that the only thing protecting his independence was his willingness to stay independent. The moment he committed to either side, he became a tool of that side's argument. He was not going to become a tool. Cassidy finished the Nova's floor pans in the second week of March, and the result was good work. Better than good, if Ethan was being honest. The kind of panel work that a restorer with twice her experience would have been satisfied with. She'd had to deal with the section near the rear seat mounting point where the rust had compromised more than the initial inspection had shown, which meant improvising a patch solution that wasn't in any standard playbook, and that she'd worked out by calling the body shop her family had run in Tennessee and talking through it with her uncle for an hour. She didn't mention that until after the work was done, which was how she handled things. Do the work, then explain it if explanation was needed. Ethan inspected the floor pans and didn't say much, which she knew meant he was satisfied. She'd learned in her first month at Mercer that the volume of his commentary was inversely proportional to the quality of the work. Good work got quiet inspection and a nod. Problems got extended conversation. "The patch near the rear mount," he said, crouching at the section she'd been worried about. "What gauge did you use?" 18, matched the original panel spec. "You called it in or you looked it up?" "Both. Cross-referenced." He looked at the seam work, ran his thumb along the weld line. "Who taught you this specific join technique?" "My Uncle Terry." "Tell your Uncle Terry it held up." He stood. "This is good work, Cassidy." She shrugged, but she was pleased, and she didn't try very hard to hide it. Danny was doing the Mustang subframe swap in Bay 2, and the sounds from that side of the shop were the particular sounds of work going slightly wrong and then being corrected. A clang, silence, muttered assessment, the restart of a process. Danny's workflow was not elegant, but it was persistent, and persistent usually got there. The shop was operating, in other words, the way it was supposed to. That mattered to Ethan in a way that he had trouble articulating, but that was real. The Dunmore 4 situation lived in his head constantly, a persistent background frequency, and the normalcy of the shop work was the thing that kept it from taking over everything. The first visit he hadn't invited came on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of March. He was in Bay 1 working on the documentation process for the Dunmore 4. Not restoration work, not yet, but the meticulous photographic and physical record that Gerald had helped him establish. When he heard tires on the gravel lot outside and looked up to see a car he didn't recognize pull in. It was a late-model luxury sedan, the kind that corporate people drove when they wanted to project confidence without ostentation. Two people got out. One was a man in his 50s in a jacket and open collar. The other was a woman Ethan recognized from the photo he'd seen attached to news articles about the Dominion Carver litigation, the one that ran whenever the trade press covered the story. Her name was Margaret Voss, She was the lead litigator for the Carver Group. He stepped out of Bay 1 and pulled the bay door down to 3/4 behind him. Margaret Voss came across the gravel with the directness of someone who had decided that the preliminary courtesy stage of this relationship was over. She was 52 or 53, according to what Ethan had read, and she had the quality of someone who had won difficult arguments so many times that the process had become unremarkable to her. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Margaret Voss. I apologize for coming without an appointment." "This is my shop," Ethan said. "I'd have preferred one." She accepted that without flinching. "Fair enough. I won't take much of your time. I'm here because I think the correspondence between our offices has reached a point where a direct conversation would be more productive. My attorney handles my communications." "I know. I'd like you to hear me directly, and then I'd encourage you to speak with your attorney." She stopped about 8 feet from him. "May I ask what your intentions are regarding the prototype?" "Not without my attorney present." "Generally speaking, are you planning to sell it?" "I don't have current plans to sell anything." Margaret Voss studied him for a moment. Not an unfriendly study, more the kind of assessment that someone made when they were trying to calibrate a person they hadn't read yet. "Dominion has approached you," she said, "multiple times, and you've declined." "I've declined the offers as structured." Something shifted slightly in her expression. "As structured? That's an interesting qualifier." "It's an accurate one." She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Mercer, I'll be honest with you. The Carver Group's position in the litigation depends significantly on establishing the original specifications of the Dunmore engineering program. The prototype you have is, if it is what we believe it to be, the most complete surviving evidence of those specifications. A court-accessible vehicle, properly documented and independently held, is worth more to our case than almost any other single piece of evidence." "I understand that." "Then you understand that we have a strong interest in this vehicle remaining independent and accessible." "I understand that too." "What I can't read," she said, "is what you want." Ethan looked at her steadily. She was not like the Dominion callers. She was not trying to manage him toward a predetermined outcome. Or if she was doing it in a way that was harder to see. He gave her credit for that, while also not giving her more than credit. "I want the car handled correctly," he said. "I want its history documented. I want it to be part of the record, not someone's private asset." He paused. "And I want fair compensation for a vehicle I purchased legitimately and have invested significant resources in documenting." "Those are reasonable positions." "I'm glad you think so. I'll have my attorney contact yours." Margaret Voss nodded. She turned to go, then stopped. "One thing," she said, "Dominion will keep offering. The number will go up. I want you to know that there's a version of this where you take their money, the car disappears into their legal strategy, and a 2-year case gets resolved in their favor based partly on evidence being suppressed rather than assessed." She said it flatly, without drama. "I'm not asking you to make a decision based on that. I'm asking you to know that it's the version they're working toward." "I know," Ethan said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she got back in the car. That evening, Ethan called Gerald Schott. "She came to the shop," he said. "Boss?" Gerald said. "Yeah. That's interesting. What did she want?" "Mostly to take my temperature." Ethan was in the kitchen at home, the notebook open on the table, the list he'd been building over the past weeks in front of him. "And to make sure I understood what Dominion's goal is if I sell to them." "Do you need her to tell you that?" "No, but I appreciated that she did anyway." He paused. "Gerald, I want to ask you something. If this goes to court, if the Dunmore 4 is introduced as evidence in the Carver case, what happens to the car?" Gerald considered this. "Depends on the court's handling. It would be documented extensively. Expert witnesses would assess it. The engineering specifications would become part of the public record." A pause. "It would take time. Could be years, depending on appeals. And after? After the litigation concludes, the car reverts to its owner. That's you, assuming you don't sell it." Ethan made a note. "Ethan," Gerald said, "can I ask what you're thinking?" "I'm thinking about what the right outcome looks like, not the financially optimal outcome, the right one." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Those aren't always different things." "No," Ethan agreed. but they're not always the same either. Dominion's second formal offer came through Sylvia on a Friday. It was structured differently from the first one. The number had gone up, 580,000 now, which was a jump that told Ethan something about how their internal assessment of the litigation risk had changed in the intervening weeks. The confidentiality provision was still there, but it had been revised in ways that Sylvia described as cosmetic, narrowed in language in places that didn't change the practical effect. They want the car gone, Sylvia said, and they want any documentation of it gone with it. The revision is designed to look like a concession without actually being one. Okay. The number is real, though. A pause. Ethan, I want to say something, and I want you to hear it as your attorney and not as someone who has a stake in what you decide. Go ahead. $580,000 is more money than this shop generates in 3 years. Your reserve is down, you've invested significantly in documentation and assessment costs, and you have 2 employees who depend on this business remaining solvent. Another pause. None of that tells you what to do, but it's the context. I know the context. Then tell me what you want me to tell them. Ethan looked at the notebook. The sentence at the bottom of that first page, "The car's history belongs to more people than the ones who can afford to fight over it," had been there for 3 weeks, and he'd looked at it enough times that it had stopped seeming like a statement and had started seeming like an answer. "Tell them no," he said, "and tell them that the confidentiality provision isn't negotiable in either direction, meaning I won't sign one regardless of the price. If they want to discuss a transparent transaction, I'm willing to have that conversation. If they need the confidentiality clause, we're done." A long pause. "Sylvia? I'm here. I want to be sure I have this right. You're refusing a $580,000 offer. I'm refusing the structure of the offer." "The structure is the offer, Ethan. Without the confidentiality clause, they have no interest in buying." "Then they have no interest in buying," he said. "Tell them." He heard her exhale. Not exasperation, more like the breath of someone adjusting to a reality they'd half expected. "All right," she said. "And the Carver Group? Tell them I'm open to continued conversation, but the car is not for sale to any party whose interest is primarily in using it as a litigation instrument. If they want to discuss a structure that preserves the historical record, something that puts the documentation in the public domain regardless of how the lawsuit ends, then we can talk. That's going to surprise them." "Good," Ethan said. "Surprised people say true things." Tetum. 3 days after Sylvia delivered Dominion's rejection, Ethan came into the shop at 6:30 and found Danny already there. That was unusual. Danny was an 8 o'clock arrival by nature and preference, and his early presence generally meant either something had gone wrong or something was bothering him. Ethan found him standing at the coffee machine in the break room, not making coffee, just standing there with his hands in his jacket pockets. "You're early," Ethan said. "Couldn't sleep." Ethan made the coffee. Danny watched him do it without saying anything. When the machine finished, Ethan poured 2 cups and handed one over. "Talk," Ethan said. Danny drank his coffee. "I've been here 6 years. I know. I took a 15% pay cut to come work here when the dealer group closed, because I wanted to work on real restoration instead of warranty claims on 3-year-old SUVs. He looked at his cup. "I don't regret that. I want to be clear that I don't regret it. But I have a mortgage and my daughter's starting college in 2 years. He looked up. "And I've been doing math." Ethan sat on the edge of the break room counter. "Tell me the math." "You turned down $580,000. The offer is structured, yes." "Ethan." Danny's voice was even but had something underneath it. "That's not principal money. That's changing your life money. That's changing the shop money. That's—" He stopped. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you I have feelings about it." "I know you do." "Do you?" "Because you've been very calm about all of this. And sometimes when you're very calm about something, it means you've already decided, and the rest of us are just finding out later." That was accurate enough that Ethan didn't argue with it. "I've decided that the confidentiality provision is a line I won't cross. That's the only thing I've decided. Even at 600? 7? Even then." Danny was quiet. He drank his coffee. Why? He said finally. Not an argument, a genuine question. The kind Danny asked when he actually wanted to understand something rather than when he was positioning. Ethan thought about how to say it. Not the formal version, the one he'd given Sylvia and Margaret Voss and Richard Calloway. The real version. You know the Dunmore team, he said. The engineers who built that car. How many of them do you think are still alive? Danny shrugged. Few, if any. It was 1970. Some of them had families. Some of them had kids who knew their fathers spent years working on something that never made it to production. And none of those people, not the engineers, not their families, not the historians who've been looking for that car for decades, none of them get to know the truth about it if I sign that agreement. Ethan set down his cup. The car is the evidence, not of a lawsuit, of work that was done by people who were good at what they did and who never got credit for it. Danny looked at him for a long moment. That's a nice answer, he said. I mean it. I know you mean it. Danny finished his coffee. I'm still going to worry about the mortgage. You should, Ethan said. That's real. But we're okay, Danny. The Avanti alone covers 6 months of operating costs once it goes to sale. The Buick is almost ready. We're okay. For now. For now, Ethan agreed. Danny rinsed his cup and set it on the drying rack. He turned toward the shop door. You know Dominion's not going to stop. I know. They're going to keep going up. They can keep going up. The number's not the issue. Danny shook his head slowly. You know what the worst part is? He said. I actually agree with you about the car and what it means and all of it. He pushed open the shop door. It's just a lot easier to agree with you when the decision doesn't cost me anything. Ethan followed him into the shop. The bay lights came on in sequence, humming, filling the space with working light. Bay 1, Bay 2, the overflow section in the back, everything where it was supposed to be. I know, he said. I'm sorry it costs you. Danny picked up his work gloves from the bench where he'd left them the night before. Don't be sorry. Just don't let it cost more than it has to. The third Dominion approach came 10 days later, and it came sideways. A man named Porter Gaines called and introduced himself as a consultant who worked with automotive companies on acquisition strategy. He was not, he said, representing any specific party in the current conversation, but he'd been following the situation with professional interest, and he wondered if Ethan might be open to a general conversation about the market dynamics around significant automotive finds. Ethan recognized immediately what this was. A back-channel approach using a consultant as a buffer, designed to have a conversation that Dominion could later claim had been independent of their direct offers. It was not illegal. It was not particularly subtle. He was polite. He said he wasn't available for general conversations at this time. He thanked Porter Gaines for his interest. He hung up and called Sylvia. I know, she said, before he'd finished describing it. They're fishing for your number. They want to know what it would take without having to put a formal offer on the record that they'd later have to account for. What do I do? Nothing. You've already told them your conditions. The ball is in their court. They're not going to accept my conditions. No, Sylvia agreed. They're going to escalate, which is when it gets less comfortable. She was right. The escalation came 4 days later, not as a call or a formal offer, but as a letter, physical mail, certified, addressed to Mercer Restoration, from a law firm Ethan didn't recognize, asserting that Dominion Automotive had a prior documented interest in the Dunmore prototype program that predated Ethan's acquisition, and that they reserved the right to pursue all available legal remedies to establish that interest. He drove to Sylvia's office that afternoon, letter in hand, and sat across from her desk while she read it. She read it twice. She set it down. She looked at Ethan. This is a pressure letter, she said. It's designed to make you feel like your title is at risk so that you'll accept their offer to make the legal threat go away. Is my title at risk? No. Their claim as described in this letter has no basis I can identify given your documented title chain. She tapped the letter. This is what happens when a corporation is used to getting what it wants and runs into something they can't buy. Ethan sat back in his chair. He felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite satisfaction. A kind of clarity, maybe. The way a decision felt when you'd been questioning it and then something happened that removed the question. Okay, he said. Okay? What do we do about it? Sylvia picked up a pen. We respond, formally, clearly, and in a way that makes it obvious that you understand exactly what they're doing and that it's not going to work. She paused. And then we contact the Carver Group's counsel and let them know that Dominion has moved from acquisition attempts to legal pressure. Will that matter? It'll matter to the judge if this ends up in front of one, she said. A company trying to suppress evidence by purchasing it is one thing. A company trying to suppress evidence through legal intimidation of the owner is something considerably more interesting to a court. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside Sylvia's window, the street was ordinary. Late afternoon traffic, a woman walking a dog, a delivery truck pulling away from the building across the road. Send the response, he said. I'll have it out by end of day. He drove back to the shop. He pulled into the lot, sat in the truck for a moment, and looked at the building. The sign above the door with the slightly high letter. The bay windows throwing light out into the fading afternoon. He'd bought 16 wrecked vehicles because he knew how to read what other people couldn't see. He'd made a decision about what he wasn't willing to do with what he'd found, and he'd held that decision through pressure that had come from multiple directions at increasing intensity. And now a major corporation had decided to move from buying to threatening, which meant one thing clearly: they were scared. Scared meant the car was exactly what he thought it was, and scared meant they didn't have another move that they were confident in. He got out of the truck and went inside. Danny was finishing for the day, wiping down tools. Cassidy had already left. The shop was winding down the way it did in the last hour of a workday. Slower sounds, the particular quiet of machines that had been running and had stopped. How'd it go? Danny said, without looking up from the tool bench. They sent a lawyer letter. Danny stopped wiping. He turned around. Seriously. Trying to claim a prior interest in the prototype. Do they have one? No, Ethan said. Sylvia's responding tonight. Danny looked at him for a moment. Then he turned back to the tool bench and finished what he was doing. You know, he said after a while, when I said I agreed with you about the car, what it means, what you're doing with it, yeah, I still agree. He hung the last wrench. I just want you to know I said it before the lawyer letter, so it counts more. Ethan almost smiled. I'll note that. Good. Danny pulled his jacket off the hook. Go home, Ethan. You look like you haven't slept in a week. 3 days, Ethan said, give or take. Close enough. Danny headed for the door. Lock up. The shop went quiet. Ethan stood alone in the space he'd built over 14 years, with the lights still on in Bay 1 and the Dunmore 4 sitting where it had been sitting since the Monday after the auction, rust and damage and history all bound together under the fluorescence. He stood there for a while. Then he locked up and went home. Sylvia's response to the Dominion letter went out on a Thursday evening and arrived, presumably, on their legal team's desks by Friday morning. Ethan didn't know what the internal reaction was. What he knew was that for 6 days after that letter was sent, nobody from Dominion called. 6 days of quiet was its own kind of communication. He used the time. The Buick estate had been finished to the point where Danny could handle the final detail work without supervision, which freed Ethan to push further on the Avanti restoration. The Studebaker was responding well. The body panels under the house paint were in better condition than the surface rust had suggested, which was the restoration equivalent of good news arriving late, but still arriving. He'd sourced a period-correct set of wheel covers through Paul Hewitt's network in Indiana, and the interior, while requiring significant work, had the bones of something that would present correctly when it was done. He worked on the Avanti in the mornings and spent his afternoons on the Dunmore documentation, which had grown into a project of its own. Gerald had helped him establish a cataloging system that cross-referenced physical measurements against the archive drawings. And Ethan had gotten methodical about it in the way he got methodical about restoration work. Sequential, thorough, nothing skipped because it seemed redundant. The documentation now ran to over 200 photographs and a physical measurement log that Gerald had reviewed twice and pronounced accurate. He had not touched the car's mechanical or structural elements beyond what was necessary for documentation. The Dunmore 4 was not being restored. Not yet. Maybe not by him. That was a decision that depended on factors he couldn't control yet. It was during the 5th of the 6 quiet days that Cassidy came to find him in Bay 1. She stood in the doorway with a look on her face that Ethan had learned to read as she had something to say and was deciding how to say it. She did this less than she used to. She'd grown more direct in the months she'd been here, but there were still topics where the approach took a moment. "There's a woman outside," she said. Ethan looked up from the measurement log. "Who?" "She didn't say her name. She's in a car in the lot. She's been there for about 15 minutes. A pause. "Nice car. Not rental nice. Actually nice." Ethan set down his clipboard. "She doesn't look like a lawyer," Cassidy added. "She looks like—" She stopped. "Just come look." He followed her to the shop entrance and looked through the side window at the lot. The car was a dark gray coupe, current model year, parked near the fence line in a spot that wasn't technically a parking space. The woman behind the wheel was visible through the windshield. Dark hair, somewhere in her 40s, sitting without looking at her phone, which was unusual enough in itself to be notable. She was looking at the shop. Ethan recognized her, not from having met her, from the clip that had been recorded at Kellerman and that had now been viewed, according to Danny's last count, somewhere north of 140,000 times. Vanessa Holloway was sitting in his parking lot. He went outside. She saw him come through the door and got out of the car. She was wearing a coat over what looked like casual clothes. Not the conference photograph Vanessa, not the CEO presenting to a room. Something closer to a person on a Saturday, except it was Wednesday and this was deliberate, which meant the clothes were a choice the same way everything else about her presentation was a choice. She walked toward him and stopped at a reasonable distance. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I owe you an apology." Ethan looked at her. He'd built a version of Vanessa Holloway in his head over the past weeks from the clip and the coverage and the things her company had done. The calls, the offers, the lawyer letter. It was a functional version, the kind you built when you needed to understand someone you were in conflict with. It was not necessarily accurate. "Okay," he said. She blinked slightly at the plainness of it. She'd probably expected something. You don't owe me anything," or an acceptance with more cushioning around it. He gave her the word and let her work with it. "What I said at the auction," she said, I was performing, if I'm honest about it. There were people around and I said something sharp because the moment seemed to call for it." She paused. "That's not an excuse. I'm explaining, not excusing. I understand the difference." "I didn't know what you'd seen in that lot." "I looked at the catalog photos the same way everyone else did." A pause. "I should have looked harder. That's also something I need to say." Ethan studied her. She was not comfortable, not in the way of someone putting on a performance of discomfort, but actually uncomfortable, which was different and harder to fake. There was something behind the executive composure that was working against it from the inside. "Do you want to come in?" he said. A brief pause. "Yes." He led her into the shop. He didn't take her to Bay 1, not yet. He took her to the break room, which was unglamorous and smelled of coffee and machine oil and old microwave meals, and which felt to him like the right place for a conversation that was supposed to be honest. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking. She took hers without comment. They sat at the small table with the uneven leg that Danny had shimmed with a folded cardboard piece that had been there for 2 years. "Your company sent me a lawyer letter," Ethan said, 2 weeks ago. "I know." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "That wasn't my decision. I was in Singapore for a board meeting. By the time I was back and fully briefed..." She stopped. "That's also not an excuse. I run Dominion. What Dominion does is my responsibility." Richard Calloway made the call. "General counsel operates within my authority. I take the accountability." She looked at him directly. "I'm not here to continue that approach. I'm here because I think we've handled this badly, and I wanted to say so to you personally." Ethan drank his coffee. It was not particularly good coffee. The shop machine was adequate and no more, but it was hot, and the morning had been cold. "What do you want to happen?" he said. Vanessa set down her cup. "I want to understand what you want to happen, because everyone on my team has been approaching this as a problem to solve, and I'm not convinced that's the right frame anymore." "What changed your frame?" She was quiet for a moment. "I watched Gerald Schott's preliminary comments. He gave a short interview to an automotive history publication. I don't know if you know he did that." Ethan did know. Gerald had told him beforehand, and Ethan had not tried to stop it, which had surprised Gerald. He talked about what the Dunmore program was, Vanessa continued, what it was trying to do, the people who worked on it. She looked at the table. One of the engineers on the Dunmore team was a man named Arthur Hollis. He worked on the chassis architecture, specifically the structural load distribution that became the center of the patent dispute. Hollis died in 1998. His daughter has been writing letters for 6 years to Dominion's archive department asking about her father's work. She paused. I didn't know that until last week. It was in a folder in the archive department that nobody had looked at in 4 years. Ethan was still. Her father spent 8 years on that program, Vanessa said, and a version of his work ended up in Dominion's platform architecture, and he died without anyone from Dominion ever acknowledging it. She looked up. I'm not saying that to make a legal argument. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I didn't know it, and I should have. The break room was quiet. Through the door, Ethan could hear Danny and Bay too, the steady sounds of someone doing work that required concentration. What are you proposing? He said. I don't have a formal proposal. I have a direction. She straightened slightly. I don't think Dominion should buy the prototype to keep it quiet. I think that's the wrong thing to do, and I think we've been pursuing it for the wrong reasons. The litigation is, there are real stakes. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But the engineering history is real too, and those shouldn't be traded against each other. Your legal team disagrees with you. My legal team is doing what legal teams do. They're minimizing liability exposure. That's their job. She said it without dismissal, just acknowledgement. My job is broader than that. Ethan looked at her for a moment. She was not the performance from the Kellerman auction. She was also not, he thought, entirely without calculation. She was a CEO, and the removal of all calculation was not something CEOs were capable of, and he wasn't going to pretend he believed it. But calculation and honesty could coexist. He'd known enough complicated people to understand that. There's a hearing, he said. The Carver litigation, pre-trial, scheduled for 6 weeks, she said. I know. The Dunmore 4 is relevant to that hearing. The engineering documentation Gerald produced is relevant. I've been talking with the Carver Group's counsel about how to make that documentation available to the court in a way that doesn't require me to hand the car over to either party. Vanessa watched him. I'm willing to have the vehicle assessed by a court-appointed expert, he said. Gerald has already offered to serve in that capacity, and I'd want independent confirmation of his findings. The documentation I've compiled would go into the evidentiary record, which means it's public and permanent, regardless of how the case resolves. And the car itself? Ethan looked at his coffee cup. The car itself, I'm willing to sell it, but not under a confidentiality agreement, and not at a price that reflects its litigation value, at a price that reflects its historical value as a prototype, to a party who will handle it correctly. He looked up. Which might or might not be Dominion. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. What does correctly mean to you? Documented provenance that's publicly accessible. The engineering history attributed to the people who built it. Physical preservation, not necessarily restoration, but appropriate storage and maintenance. And access for researchers and historians who need to study it. You want it in a museum. Or a corporate archive with those terms legally binding. Either works. Vanessa looked at the table. She was doing math, not financial math, or not only that. Something more complicated. He watched her do it and didn't try to hurry it. There's one more thing, he said. She looked up. I want to talk to you about something that has nothing to do with the car. He took her through the shop. Not a tour. He didn't explain things or present them. He just moved through the space and she followed, and he let the shop be what it was, a working place, imperfect and functional, with the specific smell and sound and light of somewhere that did real work every day. He showed her the Avanti, which was partway through its restoration. She looked at it with the interest of someone who didn't know the specific history, but could recognize that something careful was being done. 1963, he said. 1 year of production. The team that designed it was the same team that worked with Raymond Loewy. He paused. It came in as surface rust and house paint. Nobody at the auction could see past that. She didn't say anything, but she looked at it for a while. He showed her the Nova with the clean floor pans, Cassidy's work, which he noted without attributing too much to the notation. He showed her the Mustangs, one further along than the other. He showed her the Buick, which was nearly done and looked, in its current state, like something worth significantly more than its catalog condition had suggested. Then he took her to Bay 1. He didn't pull the door all the way up. He raised it enough to let in working light and stepped inside and waited for her to follow. She stood looking at the Dunmore 4 for a long time. It was still rough. He hadn't touched it cosmetically. The rust was still there, the damage still visible, the missing glass still absent. It looked like what it had been when he'd bought it, a car that nobody had thought was worth looking at. "It doesn't look like much," he said. "No." Her voice was quieter than it had been in the break room. "The roofline," he said. "You see it? It's wrong for the period. Wrong for any production year. The team was building something that was ahead of what they could actually manufacture at scale." He showed her the door gap, the B-pillar plate, the weld pattern at the rocker panel. He didn't use Gerald's language. He used his own, plainer and more direct. She followed without asking for clarification, which told him she was listening carefully. When he finished, she stood back and looked at the whole car. "Arthur Hollis worked on the chassis," she said, "and 6 other engineers whose names Gerald has in the archive. 3 of them have family members who are still alive." He paused. "None of those people know this car exists. Yet." Vanessa looked at him. The calculation was still there. It was part of how she thought, and he wasn't asking her to stop. But something else was working alongside it now. He didn't have a clean word for what it was. Something in the direction of recognition. "What did you say there was one more thing?" she said. He'd been waiting for her to remember that. He took her back to the office. He sat in his chair and she sat in the other chair, the one clients used, which had a slightly broken armrest on the left side that he'd been meaning to fix for a year. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. She opened it. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. "This is a program proposal," she said. "A framework for one," he said. "It's not detailed. I'm not a program administrator." She read through the pages. It wasn't long, 6 pages, handwritten in some places, typed in others, which was probably not how a formal proposal was supposed to look, but was how Ethan had produced it over 3 evenings at the kitchen table. The framework described a restoration training program. Vocational, hands-on, oriented toward the specific skills of automotive restoration. Not dealership service work, not fleet maintenance, but the deeper craft of working on vehicles with history. 4 to 6 students per year, paired with working restorers, using real projects with real vehicles. Duration of 2 years per student. Placement assistance at the end. The funding model was vague because Ethan didn't know enough about how such things were funded to be specific. But the need was real, and he knew it from his own experience and from watching Cassidy come in with raw talent that she'd had to develop mostly by luck of circumstance, and from knowing that Danny had almost gone to work at a dealer group instead of here because the dealer group paid more reliably. Vanessa read the whole thing without speaking. "You want Dominion to fund this," she said. "I want it to exist. Dominion funding it is one way for it to exist." He paused. "If Dominion funds it, I'm willing to sell the Dunmore 4 to Dominion's archive, at historical value, not litigation value, with the provenance publicly documented and the engineering attribution binding and permanent." She looked at him. "You worked this out before you called me in here." "I worked it out before you came to the lot," he said. "I didn't know you were coming today, but I had this ready." "Why Dominion? You could approach any number of it." "Because Dominion owes it," he said, not harshly, just directly. "Whatever the court decides about the patent dispute, the engineering from the Dunmore program is in your current platform architecture. I don't need a judge to tell me that. The car tells me that." He looked at her. "You said it yourself. Arthur Hollis's daughter has been writing letters to your archive department for 6 years. Vanessa set down the folder. She put both hands flat on the desk, which was a gesture he thought she probably made when she was thinking through something she intended to take seriously. "This would have to go to the board," she said. "I'd expect that. And the legal team is not going to like it. Publicly documenting the Dunmore provenance, even with the attribution in an archive context rather than a litigation context, I know what it does to the litigation," Ethan said. "That's not my problem to solve. You have lawyers for that. She looked at him steadily. You understand that this could hurt us in the Carver case. I understand that suppressing the history was hurting something else. A long pause. She picked up the folder again and looked at the first page. The training program, she said. Where would it be based? I'd want it connected to working shops, not a classroom program, real restoration environments. Like this one. This is one possibility. There are others. She nodded slowly. I need time. Take the time, Ethan said. The hearing is 6 weeks out. I need an answer before then, because if this doesn't work, I need to make other arrangements. Other arrangements meaning the Carver Group. Other arrangements meaning whatever is correct. He met her eyes. I'm not using this as leverage, Vanessa. I'm telling you the timeline honestly because you deserve to know it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, You called me Vanessa. Is that a problem? She thought about it. No, she said. I don't think it is. She was in the shop for 2 hours total. On her way out, she stopped in Bay 2, where Danny was working, and looked at the Mustang he was partway through with the thoughtful attention of someone recalibrating what they were looking at. How long does this take? She asked Danny. The full restoration. Danny looked at her, then at Ethan, then back at her. Depends on condition going in. This one, probably another 3 months, maybe 4 if the front subframe gives us trouble. And when it's done? It's worth about 4 times what it was going in, Danny said, which sounds like a lot until you do the math on the labor hours. Vanessa looked at the car. Do people know that, the labor that goes into it? Not usually, Danny said. They know the before and the after. The middle is where most people stop paying attention. She nodded. She didn't say anything further. She went out to her car and Ethan followed. In the lot, she turned around before getting in. The woman who did the floor pan work on that old Nova, she said. In the shop. Is she trained formally? She learned from her family's shop, her uncle mostly. And she works here. 2 years in March. Vanessa looked at the shop building. You already have the beginning of what you're describing in that folder. I know, Ethan said. That's why I know it works. She got in her car. She didn't drive away immediately. She sat for a moment, which he thought was her finishing whatever internal process the last 2 hours had started. Then she backed out and left the lot. Cassidy appeared in the doorway behind him. Was that who I think it was? She said. Depends who you think it was. The woman from the clip. Yes. Cassidy looked at the empty lot. What did she want? She came to apologize, Ethan said, and then she stayed to listen. Cassidy considered this. Did it go okay? I think so. He turned back toward the shop. How's the Corvair? The carb's a mess, but the body is surprisingly solid. Of course it is, Ethan said. Nobody looked at it. Sylvia called on a Friday afternoon, 9 days after Vanessa's visit. Dominion's legal team reached out, she said, and her voice had the quality it got when something had surprised her. They want to schedule a formal meeting, not an offer meeting, a structure meeting, their words. Ethan was in the office with the door closed. Outside, the shop sounds were the steady ambient of a late Friday afternoon, everything winding toward the weekend. When? He said. They're proposing Tuesday of next week. Their office is in the city. Tell them we'll come to them. But I want the proposal in writing before the meeting. Whatever structure they want to discuss, I want to read it before I'm in the room. I'll tell them. A pause. Ethan, this is different from the previous approaches. I know. The general counsel is on the invite list, but so is someone I don't recognize from the board level. Another pause. And Vanessa Holloway. Ethan looked at this wall across from his desk. There was a photograph there, the only photograph in the office, of his grandfather's shop in Pittsfield County, taken sometime in the 80s from the look of the light quality and the car visible in the bay. Ray Mercer was not in the photograph. He was behind the camera, probably. He was almost always behind the camera. Okay, Ethan said. Are you ready for this kind of meeting? No, he said. But I've been not ready for everything else that's happened in the last 2 months, and it's worked out so far. Sylvia made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. That's a terrible strategy. It's not a strategy, it's just what's true. All right, I'll confirm Tuesday and get the written proposal request in today. She paused one more time. For what it's worth, and I know I'm your attorney and I'm supposed to be neutral about outcomes, I think you've handled this correctly. You've told me twice it wasn't the financially optimal choice. It wasn't, she said, but there are more things to be correct about than finances. He thanked her and hung up. He sat for a minute with the quiet of the closed office around him. He thought about Danny's mortgage and his daughter starting college in 2 years. He thought about Cassidy and the floor pan work she'd solved by calling her uncle in Tennessee, the competence that had come from somewhere and that would have come from somewhere for a lot of people if those somewheres had existed for them. He thought about Arthur Hollis's daughter writing letters to a corporate archive department for 6 years and getting no answer. He thought about his grandfather in the Pittsfield County barn on a Tuesday afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag that had given up on getting clean. The car doesn't hide from you. You just haven't looked in the right place yet. Tuesday's meeting took place on the 14th floor of a building in the city that smelled like climate-controlled air and carpet that had been replaced recently. Ethan wore the better of his 2 good jackets and drove himself, which Sylvia had offered to argue against and then thought better of. The conference room had windows that looked out over the city and a table that seated 12. There were 7 people in the room when Ethan and Sylvia arrived. Richard Calloway, 2 lawyers Ethan didn't recognize, a board member named Ellis Granger who said little and observed much, a communications director whose name Ethan immediately forgot, and a woman from the corporate foundation side of Dominion's operations who had brought her own printed materials, and Vanessa Holloway, who sat at the head of the table and stood when Ethan came in, which was a small gesture and not an insignificant one. The written proposal had arrived the day before. Ethan and Sylvia had spent 3 hours on it Monday evening, working through the language, identifying the pressure points, flagging the sections where the terms were favorable and the sections where they weren't. It was not the document Ethan had brought to the first conversation with Vanessa. It was more formal and more detailed and in places more generous than he'd expected. The training program framework was there, funded through the Dominion Corporate Foundation at a level that would sustain 4 students per year for an initial 5-year commitment, with a review clause at 3 years. The archival provisions for the Dunmore 4 were there: publicly accessible documentation, engineering attribution binding, and permanent, the provenance record part of the public domain. The sale price for the prototype was set at a figure that Sylvia had negotiated upward by $40,000 in a phone call the previous afternoon, and that reflected the vehicle's historical rather than litigation value. There were still things that needed work: the specificity of the restoration training placement provisions, the language around what publicly accessible actually required in practice, a clause about Dominion's right to loan the vehicle that needed to be tightened. But the structure was there. Ethan sat across from Vanessa and worked through the document section by section with the lawyers, which took most of 2 hours and involved the particular kind of concentrated disagreement that happens when everyone in the room mostly wants the same outcome, but has different ideas about how to protect their interests in getting there. Sylvia held the line on the documentation language with a precision that Ethan watched with professional admiration. Richard Calloway conceded 3 points before noon and held firm on 2 others that Ethan was willing to let stand. At one point, Ellis Granger, the board member who had said almost nothing, leaned forward and asked Ethan directly, "What's your primary concern here? If you had to name one thing." Ethan looked at him. That the history ends up in a drawer somewhere, that the engineering attribution is there on paper but nobody can actually access it. And what prevents that in your view? A specific reporting requirement, annually, publicly, what the archive made available and to whom. If Dominion has to report it, Dominion has to do it. Granger looked at Richard Calloway, who looked at Vanessa, who said, "We can add that provision." The communications director wrote something down. By 1 in the afternoon, the major terms had been agreed to in principle, with the specific language to be finalized by Sylvia and Dominion's legal team in the following week. Calloway said the formal documents would be ready within 10 business days, which Sylvia confirmed was workable relative to the pre-trial hearing schedule. People began packing up. The board member left first with a handshake to Ethan that was brief and direct. The lawyers gathered their materials. The communications director said something about a press strategy that Ethan deferred to Sylvia on. The woman from the foundation asked for Ethan's contact information so she could schedule a site visit to Mercer Restoration. which was the first time those words had been said in that room, and which felt real in a way that the preceding 2 hours of legal language hadn't quite managed. When most of the room had cleared, Ethan and Vanessa were left near the windows. The city spread out behind her. She had her jacket over one arm and her phone in her hand, and she looked tired in a way that was visible now that the meeting was over and the performance of the meeting could be set down. "This is going to complicate the litigation," she said. It wasn't a complaint, more like a statement of fact she needed to say out loud. "I know. Calloway is not happy about the documentation provisions. He didn't show it. He's good at not showing it." She looked out the window for a moment. "The Carver case may shift significantly when the evidentiary record is in." "That's possible," Ethan said. "You're not going to apologize for that." "No." She looked at him. "I don't want you to," she said. "I want you to know I understand that." She paused. "The daughter. Arthur Hollis's daughter. I'm going to contact her." "Okay." "I don't know what I'm going to say." "You'll figure it out." She looked at him with an expression that was complicated in a way he thought she didn't usually let show. "How are you so settled about all of this? 2 months ago you were standing in a salvage auction getting laughed at." Ethan picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "I knew what was under the rust," he said. "The rest was just waiting for everyone else to figure it out." She was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in her face. Not a smile exactly, but something in that direction, reluctant and genuine at the same time. "I still can't believe you outbid me on a grouped salvage lot." "You weren't bidding," Ethan said. "My procurement team was going to. We'd flagged the lot for review." She shook her head slightly. "They passed on it. Said nothing and it was worth the catalog price." "What did they look at?" "The photographs. The catalog description." She paused. "The catalog." Ethan pulled on his jacket. "Yeah," he said. "That's usually where people go wrong." He shook her hand. It was a firm handshake, the kind between people who had been through something and hadn't entirely sorted out yet what they thought of each other. He found Sylvia in the hallway, and they took the elevator down together in the comfortable silence of people who had done what they came to do. In the lobby, before they split off toward their respective cars, Sylvia stopped and looked at him. "The training program," she said. "Is Mercer Restoration going to be one of the sites?" "That's my intention," Ethan said, "pending the site visit. You'll need to formalize the shop's operations, better documentation, clearer processes. They'll want to see that it's a real program environment." "I know." "And you'll need to hire." "I know that too." Sylvia looked at him. She was a practical woman who had handled his affairs for 3 years and who did not deal in sentiment if she could help it. But she had the look of someone who was making an exception. "Your grandfather would have found this satisfying," she said. Ethan thought about the photograph on the office wall, the old barn shop in Pittsfield County, the car visible in the bay, the man not in the frame. "He would have said I overpaid for the lot," Ethan said. "Did you?" "Not even close." He walked out into the city afternoon, which was cold and clear and ordinary, and got in his truck and drove back to the shop where Danny and Cassidy were finishing out a Tuesday that neither of them knew yet had just changed the shape of what came next. The formal documents came back from Dominion's legal team 8 days after the meeting, which was 2 days ahead of the promised 10 business days. And Sylvia read that fact the same way Ethan did, as a signal that the people on the other side had been instructed to move rather than delay. Someone at the board level had made a decision about what kind of company Dominion was going to be coming out of this, and that decision was moving faster than legal departments typically moved when left to their own rhythms. Sylvia spent a full day on the documents. She called Ethan twice with questions, once with a suggested revision to the archive access language that Dominion's team accepted within 2 hours, and once to tell him that the training program provisions were cleaner than she'd expected, with specific enrollment minimums and annual reporting requirements that had teeth in them, meaning there were financial penalties attached to non-compliance, which was the difference between a commitment and a statement of intention. She also told him that the sale price for the Dunmore 4, the number they'd agreed to in the conference room on the 14th floor, was in the document exactly as discussed. No revisions, no adjusted language that changed the practical figure. The number was the number. He signed on a Thursday morning in Sylvia's office with a pen that had a slight drag to its ink flow that made his signature look different than it usually did. Sylvia signed as witness. The Dominion signatures were already on the document, countersigned, dated, notarized. "That's it," Sylvia said when he set the pen down. Ethan looked at the pages on her desk. "Yeah. How do you feel?" He thought about it honestly. "Like I finished a job," he said. She made a copy for his records and slid it across. He put it in the folder he'd brought, the same folder that had held the 6-page training program framework he'd written at the kitchen table over 3 evenings, which felt like a long time ago now, and also not very long at all. "The pretrial hearing is next Monday," she said. "I know. Gerald will present the technical assessment. The documentation goes into the evidentiary record. You won't need to be present, but you can attend if you want." "I'll attend," he said. She nodded. "Then I'll see you Monday." He drove back to the shop. It was a clear morning in early April, the kind of morning where the light had started doing something different than it had been doing all winter, arriving at a slightly different angle, carrying something warmer in it, making the ordinary landscape look briefly less ordinary. He drove with the window down a few inches, even though it was still cold enough that he probably shouldn't, and he listened to the specific sound of his truck on a 2-lane road with no particular traffic. He thought about $63,000. He thought about a woman in a burgundy blazer laughing on a salvage auction floor. He thought about a plate on a B-pillar that said D-Mod 4 and had survived 45 years of everything the world had tried to do to it. He told Danny and Cassidy that afternoon. He did it in the break room, which had become the place where things that mattered got said. He poured 3 cups of the shop coffee, which was still adequate and no more, and sat at the table with the shimmied leg and said, without preamble, that the agreement with Dominion was signed. Danny already knew the broad shape of it. He'd known for weeks that this was the direction, because Ethan had told him after Vanessa's visit to the lot, which felt like the right thing to do for a man who'd been honest about his mortgage and his daughter's college. Cassidy knew less because Ethan had been more cautious about how much he shared with her, not from distrust, but from not wanting to create expectations that might not materialize. She listened to the summary, the sale of the Dunmore prototype, the archive provisions, the training program, with an expression that moved through several things without settling immediately on any of them. "The training program," she said when he finished. "What does that actually mean for here?" "It means this shop becomes one of the program sites. We take on 1 or 2 students per cycle. They work alongside you and Danny on real projects. 2-year commitment, with placement assistance at the end." Cassidy looked at her coffee cup. "So we'd be teaching." "Teaching is maybe too formal a word for it. You'd be working and they'd be there working with you. Same way you learned from your Uncle Terry, same way I learned from my grandfather." She was quiet for a moment. "How much say do we have in who comes in?" "Significant say. The program administrators do the outreach and initial selection, but the shop has veto on placement. Because some people aren't cut out for this work," she said. "Not as judgment, as fact." "That's right." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Terry never charged me to learn from him. He just let me be in the shop." "I know. That's what this is." "That's what this is," Ethan agreed. Danny, who had been quiet through most of this, said, "The financial side. Does this... We're okay," Ethan said. "More than okay. The Dunmore sale covers the reserve and then some. The Avanti is close to ready and goes to sale within the month. The Buick is done and the buyer is confirmed." He looked at Danny directly. "You're okay, Danny. Your job is fine. The shop is fine." Danny looked at his coffee. He'd been carrying that question for 2 months, from the day he'd watched Ethan turn down $580,000 in a phone call, and the setting down of it was visible in his face, even though he wasn't the kind of man who let relief be theatrical. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Ethan said back. They drank their coffee. Outside, a truck went by on the road. The shop was quiet the way it was quiet at the end of a day. The machines cooling down, the tools put away, the work of the day completed and assessed and accepted. The pretrial hearing was on a Monday, in a courtroom that Ethan had never been in before and that looked like courtrooms looked. Formal and slightly worn, with the particular atmosphere of a space where the stakes were real, but the procedure was old and well practiced. He sat in the gallery with Sylvia, who had dressed for a courthouse and looked appropriately authoritative in a way that she didn't always in her office. Gerald Schott sat at the front of the room with the Carver Group's counsel, which was where his role as a designated expert witness put him. He was wearing a suit that Ethan thought might have been purchased specifically for this occasion, and he sat very straight, which was not his normal posture. Margaret Voss was at the plaintiff's table. Richard Calloway was at the defense table. Vanessa Holloway was not in the courtroom. Corporate CEOs didn't typically attend pretrial hearings, and Ethan hadn't expected her to be there. What he had expected was that the hearing would be procedural and measured, and mostly comprehensible only to the lawyers involved. That was approximately what it was for the first hour. Then Gerald presented the technical assessment. He was methodical and precise, and spoke in the language of a man who had spent decades caring about details that most people found boring, and who had made peace with the fact that precision, even when it was slow, was the thing that held. He walked through the 14 manufacturing signatures, the stamp sequences, the weld patterns, the material specifications. He explained the door gap tolerance and what it meant in the context of prototype versus production work. He talked about the B-pillar plate, what DMOD4 meant, what the number sequence meant, how it cross-referenced to the archive material from the original Dunmore program. The judge asked 2 questions. Both were about the reliability of the archive material. Gerald answered both with the directness of someone who had been asked harder questions about this research by people with more technical background than a judge, and who was not going to be thrown off by the courtroom setting. Ethan sat in the gallery and watched the room. He watched Richard Calloway take notes without visible reaction, which was a skill Ethan had to admire even if he didn't particularly admire the purposes it had been put to over the past months. He watched the Carver Group's lead attorney absorb Gerald's testimony with the contained attention of someone working out, in real time, how to use what they were hearing. He watched the judge, whose expression remained professional, but whose stillness, when Gerald described the specificity of the engineering signatures, suggested that the implications were not lost on her. When Gerald finished and stepped down, Sylvia leaned toward Ethan and said very quietly, "That went well?" "Yeah," he said. "The documentation is in the record now. Whatever happens with the case, I know." She sat back. They stayed through the rest of the procedural portion, which was what it was, and left before the final administrative items. Outside on the courthouse steps, Gerald caught up with them. He had his satchel over his shoulder and the look of a man who had done something he'd been building toward for a long time. "Thank you," he said to Ethan. "Not for anything specific, just that." "You did the work," Ethan said. "You made it possible to do the work." Gerald looked at him. 11 years I've been looking for that car. You bought it for $63,000 and a willingness to look at something everyone else had written off." He paused. Arthur Hollis would have wanted to know it was found by someone who understood what he built. Ethan didn't have an answer to that wasn't inadequate. He shook Gerald's hand, and Gerald went to find his Volvo, and Ethan and Sylvia walked down the courthouse steps into the April morning. The Dominion Corporate Foundation's site visit to Mercer Restoration happened on a Wednesday in late April, 3 weeks after the hearing. 2 people came, a program director named Elena Chu, who was in her early 30s and had the organized energy of someone who ran things well and knew it, and a communications person whose role became clear as the visit went on. She was documenting, quietly and without making it the center of the visit, what the shop was and what it did. Elena Chu walked every part of the shop with the attention of someone who had been in a lot of facilities and was not going to be impressed by surface presentation, which suited Ethan fine because the shop's surface presentation was functional rather than impressive. She asked Danny questions about his background and his workflow. She watched Cassidy working on the second Mustang for about 20 minutes without saying anything, then asked 3 specific questions about the repair sequence that Cassidy answered directly and without embellishment. At the end of the visit, Elena sat in the break room across from Ethan with a legal pad and said, "I want to be honest with you about what I'm assessing. Please." The program has funding now and a framework. What it doesn't have yet is a template for what a good placement site looks like. We have a few candidate shops across the region, and we're trying to understand what the actual learning environment should be. She paused. "What I'm seeing here is useful, The mix of skill levels, the project variety, the way your staff works. It's not a teaching environment in the formal sense, but it's the kind of place where learning happens because the work demands it. That's how it's supposed to work, Ethan said. I know. That's why I'm telling you it's useful. She made a note. My recommendation is going to be that Mercer Restoration is designated as a primary site for the first cohort. That means one student placed here in the fall for a 2-year term. One student. To start, we'll evaluate at the end of year 1. She looked up from the pad. Is that workable? Yes. The student will be compensated, not at full journeyman rate, but at a level that makes the commitment possible for someone without resources. The program covers their stipend. You cover their supervision time, which is built into the program funding. I understand. Elena closed her pad. Mr. Mercer, I want to ask you something that's outside the formal assessment. Go ahead. Why did you put the training program in as a condition? You could have sold the car, taken the money, and had Dominion donate to an existing program somewhere. That would have been simpler. Ethan considered the question. He'd been asked versions of it several times since the agreement became known, by Sylvia and Danny and a reporter from the automotive trade publication who'd called after the hearing, and he'd given different versions of the same answer. This time, he tried to give the truest version. Because existing programs teach the job, he said. They teach you how to do the work that already exists. What I wanted was something that teaches people how to see, how to look at a thing that everyone's decided is worthless and know that it isn't. He paused. That's not in a curriculum anywhere. It comes from being in the room with someone who does it. Elena looked at him for a moment. Like your grandfather. He'd mentioned Ray Mercer briefly during the tour, in the context of where his training had come from. Like my grandfather, he said. She stood. She shook his hand. At the door, she turned back. One more thing. The car. The prototype. It's going to Dominion's archive facility in the fall, after the documentation transfer is complete. Did you know they're planning a permanent exhibition around it? I'd heard something about that. They're going to name it, the exhibition. She said it without drama. They're calling it the Hollis Gallery. Ethan stood in the break room doorway. Arthur Hollis's daughter, he said. She was consulted. She approved the name. Elena picked up her bag. She also asked that a copy of Gerald Schott's assessment be included in the exhibition materials. Every piece of it, the full technical record. He didn't say anything for a moment. Good, he said. That's right. The Studebaker Avanti sold in May. Paul Hewitt had connected Ethan with a collector in the Pacific Northwest who had been looking for a numbers-matching 63 for 7 years, and who, when Paul described the condition of the restoration and sent the documentation photographs, made an offer within 48 hours that was at the high end of the range Paul had estimated back in the winter. The transaction was clean, the transport arranged professionally, and the car left Mercer Restoration on a flatbed on a Tuesday morning in the second week of May. Cassidy watched it go from the shop doorway. She'd done a significant portion of the bodywork on the Avanti, and she had the expression of someone watching something they'd put real care into leave for somewhere they'd never see. You okay? Ethan said, coming to stand beside her. Yeah. She watched the flatbed turn out of the lot. It's weird. I don't usually get attached to the cars. This one was different. It looked like nothing when it came in. That's why. She turned back toward the shop. The buyer knows what he has? He spent 7 years looking for it. Good. She picked up her work gloves from the bench just inside the door. The Corvair's carb rebuild is almost done. You want to look at it before I button everything up? After lunch, he said. She went back to work. Ethan stood in the doorway a moment longer, looking at the empty space in the lot where the flatbed had been. He thought about the list of vehicles he'd brought home from Kellerman on 2 flatbeds in the rain, while the video was going up and the comments were accumulating and 140,000 people were watching a clip of him being publicly dismissed by one of the most powerful people in the automotive industry. 14 of the 16 vehicles were now completed, sold, or in final stages. The Buick had gone to a collector in Ohio who drove it to car shows on weekends and sent Ethan a photo every few months. The Nova had gone to a young guy in Pennsylvania who'd wanted his first restoration project and had gotten a car that was, Ethan told him honestly, better than a first project car deserved to be, which the young guy had taken as a compliment. The Mustangs were spoken for. The first to a repeat client, the second to a dealer who intended to resell, but who Ethan had made sign a condition disclosure that was unusually specific because he'd put too much work into that car to watch it go somewhere without an honest accounting of what it was. The 16th vehicle, the one that had kept him awake the night before the auction, the one under the tarp in Bay 1, the one with the plate on the B pillar, was still in Bay 1, awaiting the formal documentation transfer process that would precede its transport to Dominion's archive facility in the fall. He went in to look at it most mornings, briefly, the way you looked at something that had changed the shape of your life and that you hadn't entirely finished understanding yet. Much. The Carver Group litigation resolved in July, 11 weeks after the pre-trial hearing. Ethan heard about it through Sylvia, who called on a Thursday afternoon while he was under the Nova. He'd taken it back briefly for a warranty issue with the floor pan weld, a small thing, the kind of thing that happens sometimes and that you fixed without drama, and he had to slide out from under the car to take the call. The case settled, Sylvia said. Terms are confidential, but the settlement was announced publicly. What does that mean practically? It means the Carver Group received something significant enough to agree to stop litigating. It means Dominion avoided what was looking like a difficult trial given the state of the evidentiary record. A pause. It means the Dunmore documentation is in the public record regardless of what the settlement terms are, because it was submitted as evidence before the settlement was reached. So it can't be pulled back. It's in the record. It's permanent. Ethan sat on the shop floor with his back against the Nova's front wheel. The concrete was cold. His work gloves were still on. "Gerald," he said. "Does he know?" "I sent him a message before I called you." "And?" He sent back one sentence. Sylvia paused. He said, "The record is what matters." Ethan looked at the ceiling of the shop, the industrial fixtures, the faint buzz that you stopped hearing after 20 minutes. Bay 1 through the door, the Dunmore 4 under its lights. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." In August, Ethan filed the paperwork to rename and restructure the business. The sign above the door came down one afternoon while Danny held the ladder, which was the kind of task that required two people not because of the physical weight, but because taking down a sign you'd put up was the sort of thing that wanted a witness. Ethan unscrewed the brackets, lowered the sign, looked at it for a moment. The slightly elevated letter that he'd never fixed, the paint he'd applied himself, and set it against the building. The new sign went up the following week. It said, Mercer Heritage Restorations. Danny stood back and looked at it. "Heritage," he said. "It's more accurate." "To what?" "To what we're actually doing." Ethan looked at the sign. The lettering was professionally applied this time, all the letters at the proper height. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. "We're not just fixing cars. We're preserving the record of how they were built." Danny considered this. That's a lot to put on a sign. The sign just says heritage. The rest is what we do. Danny was quiet for a moment. "You're going to put it on the website too, aren't you?" "Already did." "There's a website now?" "Cassidy built it 2 weeks ago." Danny turned to look at him. "I didn't know we had a website." "We've had one for 2 weeks. And you didn't tell me." "I'm telling you now." Danny looked back at the sign. He had the expression of a man who had worked for someone for 6 years and was still occasionally surprised by them, and who had decided that this was not necessarily a bad thing. "It looks good," he said finally. "The sign. The letter spacing is better than the old one. The old one had character. The old one had one letter higher than the others because I painted it myself." "That's what I said," Danny said. "Character." Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then he went inside. The first training program student arrived in September. Her name was Priya Sandhu. She was 23, from a city 2 hours south, and she had spent 2 years doing factory-level restoration work at a facility that processed vintage vehicles quickly and without the attention that Ethan considered to be the point of the work. She'd been referred to the program by a shop owner who'd worked with Elena Chu in the early planning stages, and her application materials had included a 3-page description of what she understood restoration to mean that was unlike anything Ethan had read from someone her age. Specific, technical, and fundamentally concerned with the question of what a vehicle's history was worth. She arrived on a Monday morning with a toolbox that was too large for her car and that she'd clearly been building for years, the way mechanics built their tool collections, one piece at a time, each one chosen rather than inherited. Ethan showed her the shop. He did not make it a tour. He walked through the space the same way he'd walked Vanessa Holloway through it 6 months earlier, letting it be what it was. He showed her the Corvair, which was the current main project. He showed her the new project that had come in the previous week, a 1971 Oldsmobile Cutlass that had been in a garage for 20 years and that had the kind of benign neglect condition, dirty and dusty and mechanically dormant, but largely unmolested, that was a better starting point than a lot of cars that had been actively worked on badly. He showed her Bay 1 last. The Dunmore 4 was still there, 3 weeks from its scheduled transport to Dominion's facility. He raised the bay door and let her look. She looked for a long time. She didn't say anything, which he took as the right response. "What do you see?" he said. She walked the driver's side slowly. She crouched at the rocker panel the way Gerald had crouched that first morning, a spontaneous choice rather than a directed one. She stood and looked at the roofline. "The proportions are off," she said. "It's not a production car." "What tells you that?" "The door proportions. And the roofline radius, it's not matching anything I know from this period." She paused. "What is it?" "A prototype. From 1970. It's been in this shop for 7 months." She looked at him. "What happens to it?" "It goes to a corporate archive in 3 weeks. It'll be part of a permanent exhibition on automotive engineering history." He paused. "The engineering history of that car is now part of the public record, because someone bought it at a salvage auction when everyone else thought it was scrap, and documented it correctly." Priya looked back at the car. "You bought it." "I bought it." "At the Kellerman auction," she said. "I saw the clip." He hadn't expected that. He looked at her. "I saw it when it came out," she said. "Last February. I was still at the production facility, and we'd had a week where 3 cars came through that should have been given real attention and instead got rushed through in 4 hours because of volume targets. I was having a bad week." She looked at the Dunmore 4. "I watched the clip of you bidding on something everyone was laughing at, and I thought, that's someone who knows what he's looking at. And I looked up Mercer Restoration." Ethan was quiet. "That's when I found out about the training program," she said, 2 months later. He stood in Bay 1 with that information for a moment. It was the kind of thing that didn't have a clean response. The long, indirect way that one decision created a path that another person walked down without knowing the original decision had been made. "Well," he said, "you're here now." "Yeah." She looked at him. "Can I ask what the car's worth, the prototype?" "What it's worth to a corporate archive and what it's worth as a piece of engineering history are different numbers," he said. "The second one is larger." "How much larger?" "Depends on who's counting." He turned toward the door. "Come on, Danny's starting on the Oldsmobile, and you should be there for the initial assessment. Watch how he approaches it before he does anything." She picked up her toolbox. "What am I looking for?" "Watch what he looks at first. Everyone has a sequence. Danny starts at the firewall and works back. Cassidy starts at the floor and works up. The sequence tells you what they think matters." "And you?" He considered it. He'd never articulated his own sequence because it wasn't exactly a sequence. It was something closer to an overall first impression, the way you looked at the whole car before you looked at any part of it, the way you let the general picture settle before you started the specific inquiry. "I look at the whole thing first," he said, "before I move." "Why?" "Because the part you see when you step back is usually the part nobody else was looking at." She followed him out of Bay 1. The shop sounds wrapped back around them. Danny's radio, the Oldsmobile on the lift, Cassidy somewhere in the back with a part she was trying to source by phone. The ordinary working morning of a shop that was doing what it had been built to do. The Dunmore 4 left on a Thursday morning in late September. Dominion sent a specialized transport, a fully enclosed carrier, climate-controlled, with a crew that knew how to handle a vehicle that couldn't be driven and that needed to arrive in precisely the condition it left in. They were professional and careful, and treated the car with the respect of people who had been briefed on what they were carrying. Ethan helped load it. He guided the transport crew through the positioning, watched the straps go on at the correct points, made sure the door was secure before the carrier closed. He was not sentimental about it, or rather, he was, but not in a way that needed to be displayed. He'd had 7 months with the car. He'd documented it thoroughly enough that Gerald's complete assessment existed in 3 formats in 3 separate locations. The engineering history was in the public record and would be in the Hollis Gallery in a matter of weeks. Arthur Hollis's daughter knew her father's work had been found and correctly attributed. The car was done with him, and that was the right outcome. Danny and Cassidy and Priya stood in the lot and watched the carrier pull out. It was a cool morning, the particular quality of late September when the year was visibly changing direction, the light different, and the air carrying a smell that wasn't summer anymore. "Weird to see it go," Cassidy said. "It's going somewhere it belongs," Ethan said. "I know." She looked at the empty lot for a moment. It was here a long time. 7 months. Felt longer. Danny said nothing. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the road where the carrier had turned out of sight. He'd been quieter than usual all morning, which meant something was moving through him that he hadn't finished processing yet. After a while, he said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" Ethan said. "The clip. From February. I watched it again last week." Danny looked at him. "The moment where you put your paddle up the last time, at 63. And everyone in the room had already decided what you were doing was stupid." He paused. "You looked completely sure." "I was nervous," Ethan said. "You didn't look it." "I was nervous that I was wrong about what I'd seen in the photograph. I wasn't nervous about bidding." "What's the difference?" Ethan thought about it. Being nervous about bidding would have meant I was uncertain about the decision. Being nervous about being wrong meant I'd made the decision and was living with the uncertainty that comes after. He paused. "You make the decision with what you know. The nervousness after is just the weight." Danny considered that. "That's..." He stopped. "What?" "That's actually useful. Why don't you say things like that more often?" "I thought it was obvious." "It's not obvious," Danny said. "It's the opposite of obvious." Priya, who had been listening without speaking, she had a quality of careful attention that Ethan had noticed in her first week, and that he thought was one of the things that would make her good at this work, said, "Did you know? Before you bid. Did you actually know what was in that lot?" Ethan looked at the road. "I knew what I thought I was looking at. There's a difference. But you bet $63,000 on that difference." "I bet on my ability to read what I was seeing, not on certainty." He turned back toward the shop. "That's the only bet worth making. The one on whether you know how to look." "What?" 6 months later, the Hollis Gallery opened. Ethan went with Danny and Cassidy and Priya, which felt right. The 4 people who had been in the shop during the months when the Dunmore 4 had occupied Bay 1 should be there when it arrived at its permanent home. Sylvia came too, which surprised him slightly, and Gerald Schott was already there when they arrived, standing near the entrance with his leather satchel over his shoulder, looking at the space with the expression of a man who had been waiting for something for 11 years and was still slightly disbelieving that it had arrived. The gallery was a dedicated space within Dominion's Automotive History Center, a building that had been built for the purpose of housing and displaying the company's engineering legacy. The Hollis Gallery occupied a section that had been cleared and redesigned specifically for the Dunmore program exhibition. The Dunmore 4 was the centerpiece, displayed on a low platform under careful lighting that showed the car as it actually was, not cleaned up beyond what was necessary for preservation, not given a cosmetic restoration that would have obscured the authentic surface. The rust was there. The damage was there. The marks of its long obscurity were there because the car's authenticity was the point. The wall panels described the Dunmore program's history, the engineering team, what they were trying to build and why it mattered, and why it never made it to production. Arthur Hollis's name appeared in a section on the chassis architecture, with a description of his specific contributions that had the clarity of Gerald Schott's technical prose, accurate, specific, respectful of the work, without overselling it. There was a photograph of Arthur Hollis, which his daughter had provided. He was in his late 30s in the photograph, standing next to what appeared to be an early development frame. He was smiling in the way people smiled when they were in the middle of work they believed in. Not for the camera, but because the camera happened to catch a moment when the work was going well. Ethan stood in front of that photograph for a while. He thought about Ray Mercer in the Pittsfield County barn, the way his grandfather moved through the shop. Not quickly, never quickly, because quick was how you missed things. The way he'd said on a Tuesday afternoon with an unclean rag in his hands that the car doesn't hide from you. He thought about Arthur Hollis, standing next to a development frame in the late 1960s, working on something he believed in, not knowing that 50-odd years later, someone would pull the tarp off his work in a shop in Harwick County and recognize it by the roofline and the door gap and a plate on the B-pillar that had survived everything. He thought about Priya watching the clip in February, in a facility where cars were being rushed through without the attention they deserved, and deciding that the kind of looking she'd seen on that grainy phone footage was the kind of looking she wanted to learn. He thought about what it cost to know what you were seeing and to act on it when everyone else was laughing. Not nothing. It had not cost nothing. But here was the thing that Ethan had understood in some form since he was 17 years old in his grandfather's shop, and that the past year had confirmed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The cost of seeing clearly was always less than the cost of not seeing. The cost of missing something that was right in front of you, of deciding it was worthless before you'd looked at it correctly, that cost compounded. It went on accruing after the decision, in the engineering history that never got credit, in the skill that never got cultivated, in the car that sat in a field for 50 years because nobody had looked at it right. The auction crowd had laughed because they'd looked at 16 vehicles and decided what they were. They'd been looking at photographs of rust and come to conclusions about what was underneath it. Ethan had looked at the same photographs and come to a different conclusion, and the difference wasn't luck. It was preparation and knowledge and a willingness to trust what he knew, even when the room was full of people who disagreed. That was the thing worth learning, not the specific details of what the Dunmore 4 was or what it was worth or what legal implications it carried. Those were the contents of this particular story. The thing worth carrying forward was simpler and harder than any of that. Look at what's actually there. Not at what the photograph suggests, not at what the catalog says, not at what the crowd has already decided. At what's actually there, when you take the time to see it. Vanessa Holloway found him near the end of the opening, when most of the people in the room had shifted toward the catered tables near the back, and the gallery itself had gotten quieter. She was dressed differently from the way she dressed in the break room at Mercer Restoration. This was an event, and she dressed for events, and she was clearly in the role of the executive hosting the occasion. But she came to stand next to him in front of Arthur Hollis's photograph, with the manner of someone setting that role down for a few minutes. "Good opening," Ethan said. "The exhibition is better than I expected, honestly." She looked at the photograph. The design team wanted to clean the car up more, do a surface restoration, make it look less worn, Ethan said. "I overruled them." "I noticed, thank you." She was quiet for a moment. His daughter was here earlier, Marion Hollis. She stood in front of her father's photograph for about 10 minutes and then went and sat down and... Vanessa stopped. She was grateful. She kept saying that she was grateful. Ethan didn't say anything. "I sent her a letter in April," Vanessa said. "After our meeting, I told her about the car and what the documentation had established and what we were planning to do with it. I told her..." She paused. "I told her I was sorry it took this long." "How did she respond?" "She called me. We talked for an hour." Vanessa looked at the photograph. She said her father used to take her to auto shows when she was little. He'd stand in front of cars and just look at them, not touching them, not reading the placards, just looking. She said she never understood why until much later. Ethan looked at Arthur Hollis's face in the photograph, the smile that was for the work, not the camera. He was reading them, Ethan said. That's what she said, eventually, that he was reading them. Vanessa turned to look at Ethan directly. "Is that what you do? When you look at a car?" "My grandfather taught me that a car is a record," he said, "of the decisions that went into building it, of every hand that worked on it after. If you know how to read the record..." He stopped. "You find what you're supposed to find." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest in a way that he hadn't quite expected from her, even now. "I owe you more than the check," she said. "You don't owe me anything," Ethan said. "The agreement was fair." I'm not talking about the agreement. She looked back at the photograph. I'm talking about the fact that you didn't make it easy for us to do the wrong thing. You could have. We were offering you significant money to make it easy. I know. Most people would have taken it. Some people, he said. She looked at him. You're not going to let me make you into something exceptional. I'm a mechanic who bought a salvage lot, he said, and looked at it correctly. That's the whole story. She considered him for a moment. Then, for the first time in the many encounters they'd had over the past 8 months, she smiled without it being a performance, just a smile, brief and genuine and slightly tired. All right, she said, that's the whole story. She moved off toward the other guests. Ethan stayed in front of Arthur Hollis's photograph a while longer. He drove back to Harwick County that evening. The others had taken a separate car and gone out for dinner, which he'd begged off. Not because he didn't want to be with them, but because he needed the drive alone, and they understood that without being told. He took the 2-lane road back instead of the highway. It added 20 minutes, and he didn't mind. The night was clear and the fields on either side of the road were dark and ordinary, and the headlights of his truck made the familiar landscape familiar in a different way than daylight did. He thought about what he'd told Priya on that first morning, in Bay 1 with the Dunmore 4 still there. The bet on whether you know how to look. He thought about what it took to keep looking, month after month, at things that most people had already decided weren't worth the attention. The particular discipline of it, not brilliance, not luck, just the sustained willingness to look past what was obvious to what was true. His grandfather had done it for 31 years in a converted barn. Arthur Hollis had done it in a development facility in 1970, working on a car that the company would cancel before it ever saw a road. Cassidy had done it on a Nova floor pan, calling her Uncle Terry in Tennessee because the problem needed someone who understood the work rather than the manual. Priya was learning to do it one morning at a time, in a shop in Harwick County where the sign above the door said, Mercer Heritage Restorations, and all the letters were at the same height now. There was a car waiting in Bay 1 when he got back. Not a new acquisition, a client's vehicle, a 1967 Chevelle that had come in the previous week with an ownership history that was incomplete and a body condition that was better than the surface suggested. He'd been thinking about it since it came in. He pulled into the lot, killed the engine, sat for a minute in the quiet of the truck. Then he got out, unlocked the shop, turned on the bay lights, and went to look at the Chevelle again. Not to start work, just to look, to let the first impression settle before anything else. To give the car the attention it deserved before deciding what it was. The buzzing of the fluorescents, the smell of oil and metal, and the specific cold of a shop at night. The ordinary materials of a life spent learning to see. He stood in front of the Chevelle and looked at the whole thing first, because the part you see when you step back is usually the part nobody else was looking at. And that was where it always started.